Okay, tonight we have with us Mitchell Mote, who is an extension agent, a horticulture, agriculture in Rutherford County. And I've worked with Mitchell for several years now, and he's going to talk to us about turf grass management in Tennessee. So I am going to turn it over to you because I really have no announcements. If y'all want to put your questions in the chat box, or you can unmute if you have a burning question, just needs to be answered right then and there. But otherwise, please keep your microphones muted and your phones turned on silent. So Mitchell, thank you for being here with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good deal. Well, I appreciate the opportunity, the invitation to spend this time with you tonight. You know, this however long this is going to take, you know, that's that much of your life you'll never get back. So the fact that you're willing to spend it here with me, well, I view that as a real compliment. Now, as far as I know, I may be the only thing standing between you and a good night's rest. So I'll try to make this as painless as possible as we go through here. And Carla, I would ask you if you'd kind of monitor the chat if we have any questions pop up in there. Okay.
Okay, we'll do.
All right, let's get started on this topic of turf grass management in home lawns in Tennessee. I guess the first thing I would suggest to you is read your book. You've got a pretty good chapter on turf grass management that's part of the Master Gardener Intern Manual. And a lot of smart folks have spent a lot of time putting that together. And if you were to do nothing else, read that book, then you're going to come away knowing way more than you would after sitting here listening to me for the next while this evening. So that's the first suggestion I would make to you. Now, as you complete your Master Gardener Intern training and you go through the process of becoming a certified Master Gardener, all the folk or many of the people in your sphere of friends and acquaintances are going to learn that you're a Master Gardener, and because of that, then you're going to be viewed as a source of information. And folks are going to ask you questions. And one of those questions, or a common question that people tend to ask Master Gardeners is which turf grass species is best? What's the best grass for me to grow? And you can see several different species listed here on this slide. You got centipede grass, Bermuda grass, Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, fine fescues, ryegrass, etc. About the only one that won't work for us is St. Augustine grass, not in our part of the world, that's listed right there. So I'm going to tell you right now the answer to that question. You can use this answer and it'll always be correct, and that depends. That just depends on what it is you want to do. It depends on what your expectations for appearance and performance and quality are. It depends on what your site is like. So as I've said that, we're going to jump right into this. First thing I would suggest, or that you should suggest to anybody asking you this question, is you tell them to evaluate their site and consider the different characteristics of the grasses that are out there before making a choice. You know, in most cases, folks are going to be growing a perennial grass, and you hope this is going to be a long-term relationship. So the idea of choosing the one that's best suited for the site, you know, it has some importance in it, I think. Sometimes the best answer you can give people is don't grow any grass at all. Is the site in question suited for growing turf grass? Does it have enough soil depth? Does it have enough sunlight? You know, we can sometimes control the amount of water that plants receive through irrigation, and we can have a big influence on what the nutritional level is through the addition of fertilizers and other amendments. But we can't do a whole lot about increasing soil depth over a large area at any one time. And depending on the location, you may not be able to do much about improving the amount of sunlight that a given area receives. So if a site does not have enough soil depth, you know, how much is enough soil depth? You know, if it doesn't, the more soil, the better. You can't have too much. But if you don't have at least 6 inches of soil, then the idea of maintaining a dense stand of turf grass throughout the course of a growing season, throughout the course of a year, you know, it's just not realistic at all. You can see in the slide here, that's a picture of a septic tank. How do I know that? Because it's mine. It's my septic tank. And you can always locate that septic tank in the hot summertime because the grass dies, because the ground is very thin. It's not deep enough to hold any water. And so that grass is going to die. Conversely, even those shade tolerant grasses have got to receive enough sunlight because they're still green grasses, they're still green plants. They've got to catch sunlight in order to perform photosynthesis to create their own energy. So if a site doesn't get, you know, a minimum of 4 hours of filtered sunlight. It doesn't have to be direct sunlight, but the equivalent of 4 hours of filtered sunlight throughout the course of the day, it's not going to be very successful at maintaining the population of turf grass. Okay. So once you have decided, or anybody has decided that the area will grow grass, then you start thinking about choosing the grass to grow there. And the grasses can be categorized different ways. They can be categorized by how they grow or their growth habit. So you basically have two choices. You have grasses that grow in a bunch, and you see some listed here: annual ryegrass, tall fescue, chewings fescue, hard fescue, sheep fescue. Those are all categorized as fine fescues. We'll talk about those a bit later. But they're bunch grasses. They don't creep, they don't spread. Now you see an asterisk right there. Some tall fescue varieties may have short rhizomes, but that's not enough of a creeping habit to really count as a creeping grass. So tall fescue is a bunch type grass. They grow in bunches. They stay where you put them. Then conversely, you've got the sod forming or the creeping grasses. And you'll see them listed here next to the bunch type grasses. You've got those that are called rhizomatous grasses. They spread by rhizomes, and a rhizome, we'll see a picture of it in a minute, but it's a below ground shoot that runs laterally underneath the surface of the soil. Kentucky bluegrass, strong creeping red fescue are examples of grasses that spread via rhizomes. Then you've got those that creep via stoloniferous grasses. Centipede grass and St. Augustine grass are stoloniferous grasses. They don't have rhizomes, but they grow via, or they spread via stolons. And a stolon is basically the same thing as a rhizome, except it grows on top of the ground versus growing underneath the ground. And then you've got those grasses that spread via a combination of rhizomes and stolons. The Bermuda grass and zoysia grass that you see listed here. Those grasses grow below ground as well as above ground. They spread laterally above ground as well as below ground. The bunch grasses, we talked to, or I mentioned that they grow in clumps or bunches. And you can see here how an individual grass plant or how an individual bunch type grass plant can develop into that clump or that bunch. As you see them listed here from right to left across the slide, you see a grass plant and what's called one tiller. The tillers are the side shoots that grow up from the base of the plant. So you have the primary shoot with the leaves on it, and then you put off this side shoot. That first side shoot, that's a tiller. Then you've got the two tiller grasses. As they grow and develop. So they'll have two side shoots. Then you'll see 4 tillers and up to 7 tillers and so on. And that's how that single grass seed, when it germinates and it grows a shoot, it starts to make a grass plant, how that plant grows, how it forms that clump. It'll only get so big. Okay, it's not going to spread forever and ever. Those clumps will only produce so many tillers. That bunch will only get so big. So basically, those grasses don't creep, they don't spread. They kind of stay where you put them. These are examples of tall fescue grass plants. Tall fescue is a bunch grass, and those are individual tall fescue plants that are grown. Now, they're not grown at a high population density. There's lots of space in between them, so you can see the individual plants. But that's what a bunch grass does. It grows in a clump. So bunch grasses don't creep, they don't spread. That's not a very attractive appearance that you see right there, but we don't grow those grasses at that low population density. We grow all turf grasses at a very high population density. When we look at seeding rates, you're talking well over, 1 million seeds per pound, or excuse me, 1 million seeds, per 1,000 square feet of grass out there. So you're going to be growing those grasses at a very high population density. So you don't see that bunch type growth habit. Now, we'll compare that to the creeping grasses. So here in this example, there's this plug of zoysia grass. The arrows are pointing to allegedly a stolon above ground and a rhizome below ground. They're very hard to see in this image. So let's look at this image. On the top picture, you see an example of a Bermuda grass stolon. That Bermuda grass stolon is that lateral shoot that spreads out over the surface of the ground, and each node along that stolon, the plant has the potential. That stolon has the potential of putting down roots, and you can see out towards the end there, as well as back on either end of the grass, where those nodes on the stolons are starting to produce a root, and that's how they can spread above ground. And conversely, you've got a rhizome, a zoysia grass rhizome, down in the lower picture. Well, that's an underground shoot that runs out laterally below the ground. So that's an example of how those grasses that have rhizomes can spread laterally below ground. So you've got bunch grasses, you've got creeping grasses. Here's an example of a centipede grass stolon. All right, that's one of those grasses that spreads, but it spreads only by above ground stolons. But anyway, they're all similar in appearance. The stolons of a Bermuda grass plant, the stolon of a centipede grass plant, they have some same characteristics. Now, they'll they'll vary in texture, they'll vary in size and in thickness, etc. But all those creeping grasses, the stolons are all similar, as well as the rhizomes are all kind of similar to one another. All right, we categorize grasses by how they grow. We can also categorize them by when they grow. So this slide is just to indicate that where we live here in Tennessee, we're in what's called the transition zone from a turf climate standpoint. We've got the cool, humid region to the north of us. We've got the warm, humid region to the south of us. And we're kind of in between the two of them. So we're in the transition zone. It transitions from one to the other. What does that mean in terms of us growing turf grasses here? What it means is that we grow both warm season grasses and cool season grasses. But someone once said that we just can't grow them very good because we're not in a cool, humid environment. We're not in a warm, humid environment. We're in the transition zone. Some folks might agree with that. I'm not sure. But anyway, we're in this transition zone. And so that when we talk about grasses growing, when they grow, we're talking about the season of the year when they grow. So we can categorize the grasses as being cool season or warm season. The cool season grasses you see listed here, common ones, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, all of the fine fescues, as well as the ryegrasses. That's perennial ryegrass and annual ryegrass. Then on the warm season grass side, Bermuda grass and zoysia grass are by far the most common ones that you'll run across in Tennessee. You may find some centipede grass in places here in Middle Tennessee. Probably more apt to find it over in West Tennessee and in southern Western Tennessee. St. Augustine grass is highlighted down there. That is a warm season grass, but in many places, in regions of the state of Tennessee, it gets too cold for it to survive during the wintertime. Maybe down in southwest Tennessee, you might have some St. Augustine grass that will survive there. But from, realistically, it's not feasible that we're going to grow St. Augustine grass in the Middle Tennessee, whether we're in the southern part of Middle Tennessee or the northern part of Middle Tennessee. So those are the seasons of growth of these grasses, cool season versus warm season. So that's a choice to make. Cool season grasses, as the name implies, do their best growth in the cooler months. If you chart out their growth curve, they have two peaks. The tan line or the khaki colored line indicates shoot growth. The blue line indicates root growth. Root growth occurs, or maximum root growth occurs at slightly lower temperatures than does the maximum above ground shoot growth, or vertical shoot growth. In a perfect world, these grasses do their most aggressive above ground growth from 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the weather progresses from spring into the summer and the temperatures start going up, these grasses become stressed and they're going to slow down. It's just a way of trying to conserve themselves and protect themselves, so the growth rate slows down, and there'll be a slump right there during the hottest, especially if it's dry, during the hot, dry periods of the year. They don't grow very well at all, and their appearance may start to suffer. They go off color. They start to take on some brown coloration, etc. And then as the summer progresses into fall, the days start to get shorter, the temperatures start to drop down at night especially. You'll see those grasses perk back up again, assuming there's adequate moisture out there. And they'll pick back up and have another growth spurt in the fall of the year. So that's that's the cool season grasses. Root growth on those can happen down near freezing, but maximum shoot growth 65 to 75 degrees. Once you get past 90 degrees on the cool season grasses, the above ground shoot growth is really going to slow down considerably. As I mentioned, during the hot months, those cool season grasses can show some heat injuries, some heat and drought injuries. You can see in this example of a tall fescue lawn that has taken on some of those typical hot, dry color characteristics that are associated with the cool season grass growing in hot weather. Conversely, a warm season grass is one that is not going to grow until it does get warm. These grasses have a shorter growing season than do the cool season grasses. This slide illustrates the growth curve of warm season grasses, and it's the same curve for Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, centipede grass. More or less, they follow that same general pattern. They do their best growth at 85, 95 degrees. That's when they really love it. They're not growing much right now. It's frosted. It's knocked them back into dormancy in most places, and they're going to remain dormant. They're not dead. They're dormant and they're not going to be actively growing above ground until next spring, when conditions change and it gives those grasses the signal it's time to start breaking that dormancy and to begin growing again. Soil temperature has a lot to do with that, as does the amount of sunlight that's present during the course of the day. So as the ground warms up in the spring and the days get longer, these grasses will start to break dormancy and begin to show some growth. The black line here indicates shoot growth. Typically, the shoot growth on warm season grasses will be greater at a little higher temperature than will root growth. Root growth will take place, down into the 50s. Above ground shoot growth on these cool season, warm season grasses is going to, once you get out of the 60s, it's just going to be pretty much non-existent in terms of growing. It may remain green until frost comes along. They just don't grow very much in cool parts of the year. So they have the shortest growing season. Typically, they don't begin growth until, maybe the middle of April, sometimes it may be as late as May, depending on how the spring progresses. And then once that good hard frost comes in the fall of the year, it knocks them back into dormancy. Knowing, you see a pattern like this on a warm season grass, this is a frost pattern on Bermuda grass. And if the weather conditions there in Montgomery County have been anything like they were here in Rutherford County the last couple of weeks or so, then you very likely have seen this kind of frost pattern on Bermuda grass. That frost occurred, and it wasn't a really, really super hard frost, but it was enough to start throwing that grass into dormancy, and you can take on this mosaic look to it. So I guess the point is that, understanding how these grasses grow and some of the stresses that can occur to them, how that influences their appearance, that can have a big impact on you making a decision as to whether or not you're going to grow these grasses. If you choose a cool season grass, you don't have an irrigated site, you don't have irrigation on your site, then they're going to be stressed, and you're going to see some decline in performance and in appearance on those grasses. And conversely, those warm season grasses are going to go dormant unless the climate changes dramatically more than it has thus far. They're going to go dormant because it will frost on them. It's going to get cold enough that they're not going to grow above ground anymore. They're going to go dormant. So those warm season grasses, here's an example of Bermuda grass. It's in full dormancy. It's got that perfectly uniform brown color. I hear people say that I don't like Bermuda grass for a couple of reasons. And one of those is because it turns brown in the wintertime. It looks dead. Well, it may look dead. It's not dead. Okay, it's not dead. It's dormant, but it is brown. But the thing to keep in mind is that in the world of lawn care and in turf management, uniformity of appearance is one of the ideals. And if the entire turf area is uniformly brown, that's pretty darn uniform. And brown is a color. Just remember that. So keep that in mind. Another thing to think about is how those grasses grow, the bunch grasses versus the creeping grasses. Here's an example of Bermuda grass stolons running across the surface of the ground. They're going to cross this curve and crawl over into a flower bed. So for some folks, that is a maintenance nightmare, trying to keep the creeping grasses out of their flower beds, out of their mulch beds, etc. So that's a challenge for them. Other folks are going to view it as a real strength because those creeping grasses do creep, and they can creep back in and fill in places that are damaged due to traffic or due to, maybe a gasoline spill, or maybe you're making ice cream on the 4th of July, homemade ice cream outside, and the salt water spills onto the Bermuda grass and it kills a spot. That's okay. It'll creep back in from the surrounding areas and fill that spot back in, whereas in a bunch grass, it doesn't do that. But the point is, if you understand how these different grasses grow and their characteristics, then you can be prepared for those kinds of things. You don't have to become frustrated trying to manage those different habits and so on. So we've talked about the different grasses, how they grow, when they grow, etc. So let's look at some of these in a little more detail. We'll start looking at cool season grasses first. Tall fescue is by far the most frequently used cool season turf grass in Tennessee. From a texture standpoint, and texture just refers to blade width, how wide that blade is. So tall fescue is going to be a coarse to a medium coarse textured bunch grass. Compared to fine bladed grasses, fine textured grasses, tall fescue will not be considered really fine textured, kind of medium textured at best. Tall fescue does have some shade tolerance. It's not super deep shade. It doesn't grow well in really dense shade, but in some moderate shade, it'll grow fairly well there. It's got pretty good wear resistance. There are many different cultivars of tall fescue available. And a cultivar, that's just putting two words together, cultivated variety. lawns. So there are many varieties of tall fescue. They're all the same species. They're all tall fescue. They're all bunch type grasses, but there are a lot of different varieties out there. And even though they're all the same species, there's some genetic difference from one variety to another. They're not all exactly the same. You'll see on the slide here in parentheses, it says turf type tall fescue. So I would suggest to you that if you're going to choose tall fescue as your lawn grass, that you choose a turf type tall fescue variety. Well, what makes the turf type tall fescue different from another tall fescue? Well, here's an example of that. In this photograph, this is here at our office in Murfreesboro, the Rutherford County Extension Office. We have a turf grass demonstration area here. And in this photograph, you see the two square plot, the rectangular plots up at the top of the slide. One on the left is lighter green color as compared to the one to its right. The one on the left is a Kentucky 31 tall fescue. That is an unimproved, it's non-turf type tall fescue compared to the turf type tall fescue to the right that has a darker green color. The turf type tall fescues are going to have greater or a darker green color potential. Typically, they will probably be a little finer textured, more to the medium texture compared to the coarse texture of the old unimproved Kentucky 31 tall fescue. So when you hear the term turf type tall fescue, that's comparing that tall fescue to the old original Kentucky 31 tall fescue. It's not that the Kentucky 31 is not improved, doesn't have those more desirable turf type qualities of darker green color, finer texture, maybe some improved disease resistance, maybe some improved drought resistance, etc. But again, all tall fescues are cool season grasses, they're bunch grasses, but there's a lot of variation out there in terms of different cultivars, different varieties available. Most commonly, you're going to find them sold in garden centers in packages that are referred to as blends. And a blend just means that there is more than one variety of the same species of grass in that package. There may be as many as 3 or even up to 5 different varieties. For example, there's one of the local retailers here sells a 5-star tall fescue. Well, that just means it has 5, or in this case, it means it has 5 different varieties of tall fescue in there, but they're all tall fescue. Many others very often will have 3 different varieties. I think it makes sense to do that because even though it's all the same species, there is some diversity in the genetics, and possibly, one or more of those varieties may be better able to resist a potential problem that could occur during the course of a growing season. And so the entire population or the entire stand of grass will not be adversely affected by that problem if one or more of those varieties does have, better resistance to it than some of the others do. Here's Kentucky bluegrass. If you look at that Kentucky bluegrass stand right there, if you look at it close, you'll see a very, very uniform population of turf grass. Kentucky bluegrass is a medium to medium fine textured rhizomatous grass. So that tells us it's a creeping grass. It spreads by below ground rhizomes. It is very uniform in color and in texture. Now, it does, compared to tall fescue, it has a higher water use rate and a lower drought tolerance, and it doesn't have as much shade tolerance as tall fescue. So if an individual is going to choose to grow Kentucky bluegrass as a primary grass in a home lawn, it's going to be real important that they have access to irrigation, because that grass is not going to be as tolerant to drought and the heat as, say, the tall fescue would be. So to maintain a good population of the grass, to keep it as healthy and as vigorous as possible, irrigation is kind of essential for that. So for that reason, we don't see as much Kentucky bluegrass. We don't see as many Kentucky bluegrass lawns in Middle Tennessee or Tennessee in general as we do tall fescue. Then we shift over to the fine fescues, and they're different species. The chewings is a fine fescue species. Hard fescue is a fine fescue species. Sheep fescue is a fine fescue species. Slender creeping red fescue, strong creeping red fescue. They're all fine fescues, and they're called fine because you look at this image right here, and I think that is some creeping red fescue. I'm not certain in that picture, but notice how fine the blades are, how narrow they are. Compared to tall fescue, there's no comparison at all. They're much finer. and that's why they're called fine fescues. When it comes to a shade-tolerant turf grass, probably fine fescues are the most shade-tolerant choices that we have out there. And there are some differences, in them. They're different species. Okay, the chewing fescue is a different species than the hard fescue, and the hard fescue is a different species than strong creeping red. But they're all a fine fescue, so they do have some shade tolerance. The chewing fescue is probably the darkest green of all those. The hard fescue probably has the greatest the greatest heat tolerance. The strong creeping red fescue does creep. It does spread some by rhizomes below ground. Not a super strong creeping grass, but it will creep more than the other. It creeps more than tall fescue does. It may have those short rhizomes, and then the other fescues the other fine fescues aren't creeping fescues. So it does spread some, but not as vigorously as say Bermuda grass or Zoysia grass would in that case. And it's of those grasses, the strong creeping red is a more vigorous grass than say the slender creeping red is. So I said all that to say that if you're going to try to grow a turf grass, a cool season turf grass in a shaded environment, and again, it's got to have some sunshine. It can't be 100% shade all day long. But a mixture of two or more of these different fine fescue species might be something to consider. A mixture differs from a blend. Okay, a blend is two or more varieties of the same species packaged together. Well, a mixture is two or more species packaged together. So if you look at a package of grass seed at the garden center that's labeled as a shade grass, you're going to see multiple species listed on the seed tag, on the label there of that package of grass. So it's not uncommon to maybe have some chewing fescue and some strong creeping red fescue, maybe with some hard fescue all mixed together in one of those more shade tolerant mixes. Okay, ryegrasses. Those are the last of the cool season grasses that we'll mention here this evening. We have two kinds of ryegrass: perennial ryegrass and annual ryegrass. Well, perennial ryegrass is in the right part of the world will be a perennial grass, but for us here in Tennessee, because it is not as able to, it doesn't survive as well under the hot and dry summer conditions that we often experience here. It doesn't really act like a perennial. It's difficult to maintain a dense stand, just a pure perennial ryegrass. So probably the greatest use that you'll find of perennial ryegrass in Tennessee is as an overseeding choice for dormant Bermuda grass. So I mentioned the Bermuda grass that people say, Bermuda grass is great, but it turns brown in the wintertime and I like the brown color. So what they'll do is overseed that Bermuda grass with perennial ryegrass in the late summertime, so that you don't ever see the Bermuda grass go dormant, because the ryegrass germinates and is growing along there in combination with right together with the Bermuda grass. And when it frosts, Bermuda grass goes dormant, the ryegrass continues to grow, so it stays green, throughout the course of the wintertime until the Bermuda grass begins to break dormancy and come out next spring. Compared to the annual ryegrass, the perennial ryegrass has a nicer. I say nicer. That's not a very descriptive word, I guess. It has a finer texture. Okay, it's not as coarse bladed. It will have a darker green color than annual ryegrass will. So it has. It can serve as a higher quality overseed for dormant Bermuda grass during the dormant season. It germinates very easily compared to other grass seeds. The perennial ryegrass and annual ryegrass both germinate very readily. The annual ryegrass, you see it here. From a cost standpoint, it's by far the cheapest grass seed out there. It is for sure a temporary grass. It is an annual. It's purely an annual. Back up a second. You can see in the picture, compared to the perennial ryegrass in the previous slide, it's wider texture. It's also has more of a slick surface to it, kind of a shiny surface. It's going to be paler green in color than the perennial ryegrass will be. And as the season progresses from early spring and the latter spring time period, that grass tends to produce less leaf tissue and more stem, and it takes on a stemmier look, and it's not nearly as leafy as it was otherwise. It's going to, as the summer progresses, or as the spring progresses towards summer and the temperatures start to warm up, that grass goes ahead and dies out very easily. Okay, so those were the cool season grasses. Now let's shift gear, talk about some of the warm season grasses. Bermuda grass, probably the most common warm season grass that we grow in Tennessee. Bermuda grass is an extremely aggressive, durable, creeping, running turf grass, extremely aggressive. It can be anywhere from medium texture to very fine texture, depending on the cultivar that's out there. There are a lot of different cultivars of Bermuda grasses that they have been developed from the old traditional common Bermuda grass to have finer turf type qualities. It has great heat tolerance, but it has very poor shade tolerance. Bermuda grass is not a shade tolerant grass. You're not going to grow it in a shady place at all. Okay, so if you've got a shady site, Bermuda grass is not an option for you whatsoever. There are different types of Bermuda grass, and they're categorized by being vegetative types, meaning that those grasses don't produce a lot of viable seed. So those grasses, the seed is not harvested from those grasses. These types, vegetative types, have to be established vegetatively by sod, for example. You know, the sod is harvested, and that's how you get for example, a Tiff Sport Bermuda grass lawn by putting in Tiff Sport Bermuda grass sod. Those grasses don't produce enough viable seed to make it feasible to harvest them, so they're vegetatively propagated. They can also be plugged, and all a plug is just a small piece of sod, or they can be sprigged. And a sprig is just a piece of the stolon, the above ground shoot. You know, it's still alive, but it has those nodes on there. And if you harvest the supplier harvests those sprigs, and then they are able to broadcast those sprigs out onto a site and work those in and kind of bury them, and they get irrigation on them, and the temperature is right, and those nodes start to produce roots, and then you'll get a population of grass out there. And here's examples of, in the previous slide here, it shows some different examples of vegetatively propagated Bermuda grasses. There are lots of different ones out there. If you go to a sod farm that produces Bermuda grass, you know, they will have probably multiple, a few choices of the Bermuda grass sod that they're growing there, vegetatively propagated sod. Here's examples. This one on the left is called Latitude 36 compared to Tiffway Bermuda grass, which is the one on the right. You know, in this slide, this picture, the two growing side by side, you can see some differences in them. The Latitude 36 may be a little finer texture as compared to the Tiffway on the right, which looks like it might be a tick coarser texture. But anyway, there are also then seeded varieties of Bermuda grass, and those varieties, they produce enough seed that it's economically feasible for a supplier to harvest those seed. And these are examples listed here of some pretty good seeded varieties of Bermuda grass. So if you're looking to establish a Bermuda grass lawn, you have the option of using either a seeded variety or a vegetatively propagated variety. So just the availability, you know, the supply in your particular area may dictate which way you go with that, but there are both types out there. Here's an example of Riviera Bermuda grass. That is one of the seeded varieties. Now let's talk a minute about zoysia grass. You know, zoysia grass is not just a single species. There are multiple species of zoysia grass. There's probably about 3 that are grown primarily as turf in the southeastern part of the United States. Zoysia grass has a lot of similarities to Bermuda grass. From the standpoint, it's very durable. It's a heat-loving grass. It tolerates the heat, dry conditions very well. It does creep, it does spread. Although it is slower growing, it is not as aggressive as Bermuda grass is. And there are some varieties of zoysia grass that are much more shade tolerant than Bermuda grass. So if you've got a moderately shaded area and your goal is to grow a warm season grass, then choosing one of those more shade tolerant zoysia grasses, you know, would be something that you might consider. Again, it's similar grass and its drought tolerance. From a texture standpoint, zoysia grass can be anywhere from the coarse textured side more to the medium fine texture in terms of blade width. Just like Bermuda grass, some of the zoysia grass cultivars are vegetatively propagated only. They don't produce enough viable seed. Matter of fact, most zoysia grasses don't produce enough viable seed. They have to be vegetatively propagated. And you can see examples here, like Cavalier, it says ST. Well, that ST just means that's more of a shade-tolerant variety. El Toro is a shade-tolerant zoysia grass. Palisades is a shade tolerant. Xeon is a shade tolerant. Zorro is more of a shade tolerant zoysia grass. And there are lots and lots of cultivars that are available today that aren't listed here on this slide. I just want to point out that there are different options in terms of establishing zoysia grass. It can be vegetatively established. Here's an example of the old Meyer Z52 zoysia grass. Notice how ragged and jagged the leaf blades are, the tips there. That tells you that grass has really got, it's a tough grass, very fibrous. It takes a good sharp mower blade to cut it. You know, if you've seen those ads in Sunday magazines, newspapers, and whatnot about buying zoysia grass plugs, if you read the fine print, very often you'll see that that company is selling Meyer Z52 zoysia grass. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, Meyer it's old, it's been around a long time. It can work very well, but it's a very fibrous, it's tough grass, takes a good sharp mower blade to cut it to make it look nice. The only thing I would say about buying plugs out of a magazine is that's kind of an expensive way to buy grass. You might be able to find it a bit cheaper than that. There are seeded types of zoysia grass out there, and you can see four listed up here. The one that I have seen most often in Tennessee, offered by the garden centers and the turf grass supply folks, is Zenith. That variety, Zenith zoysia grass. That's one that is available from seed. The seeded varieties are slow to germinate and develop. Here's an example of Zenith seeded zoysia grass. There's kind of what it looks like. You know, it may not be as dark green as some of the other varieties out there, but it is an option for establishing zoysia grass from seed versus having to plug it in or to buy sod. So those options are available to you. And finally, we'll wind up with centipede grass. You know, it's another heat tolerant grass that does spread by stolons. And, you know, some folks report that the centipede grass does have a little bit of shade tolerance as compared to Bermuda grass, but it's not nearly as shade tolerant in most cases as some of those zoysia grass varieties would be. Now, it is a heat loving grass. Again, it's just like Bermuda grass and zoysia grass. It's got to be hot for it to grow very well, but it's not as drought tolerant as Bermuda grass or zoysia grass. And so as long as you're getting adequate moisture during the hot weather, it looks good. But if you get into a dry spell and you don't supply irrigation to centipede grass, it will start to go off color and show some drought stress much faster than Bermuda grass or zoysia grass would. Centipede grass is often thought of as a low input grass. It doesn't require nearly as much nitrogen, say, as Bermuda grass or zoysia grass would to look its best. So from that standpoint, it is a lower input kind of grass. I'd mentioned like with Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, you got those vegetatively propagated as well as some seeded varieties. There's a seeded variety of centipede grass. It's called Tiff Blair, and this is it right here. It's a pretty good seeded variety. And I say it's pretty good because what makes it good is that it's cold tolerant. And that's the reason that centipede grass has not been used as widely as, say, Bermuda grass and zoysia grass in Tennessee in previous years in our past, is because a lot of the centipede grass varieties out there weren't all that cold tolerant. It would get cold enough to cause some significant freeze damage to it. This Tiff Blair seeded variety of centipede grass was developed a few years ago to be cold tolerant. I have some growing in a plot here at our turf demonstration area in Murfreesboro. It's been growing now for 12 years, and it's done very well in terms of standing up to the cold weather that we sometimes experience in the wintertime. So a question that people will often ask is, so can I grow the perennial warm and cool season grasses together since we live in this transition zone? And can I do that? Well, the answer is yeah. This is the United States. This is America. You can do what you want to. But if you do that, then at times of the year, some of those grasses are going to look pretty good and others are going to be dormant. And you may wind up with a very patchy appearance on the lawn. Other times of the year when, the cool season grass is still growing good in the springtime, so like up in May and June, and the warm season grass is out of dormancy, can look very uniform. But then once you roll around in the cold weather and it frosts on it, then that warm season grass will go dormant and you'll start to see those patches show up, like what you see in this picture here. So typically it's not, if your goal is to have a very, very uniform turf, then the warm season and cool season perennial grasses don't grow together all that well. I guess that's my point. Okay, so we've talked about the different kinds of grasses that are out there that are available for us to think about choosing in a home lawn in Tennessee. So let's get them in the ground. So we've chosen one, now we got to get them planted. During the building phase of a new home, that's very often when the most good can be done for a home lawn, because you're starting with a blank slate. You've got a clean canvas. And if you can get that lawn graded, get it clean, free of debris, etc., you can do a lot of good there towards giving that home lawn, that turf grass, a chance to get a good start and to grow in and provide you years of good quality out there. Part of the deal is you want to have a very uniform surface, a good planting bed. If you need to add organic material to improve the soil, during the construction of the yard, the building of the yard, that's a prime time to do that. When you're getting ready to plant, just like you're preparing a vegetable garden for planting, you're going to prepare a planting bed for this turf grass seed. A planting bed should be firm. Okay, it should be relatively free of any other plant material. You don't want competition out there in the form of weeds or other grasses. And in that case, those other grasses would be weeds also. It needs to have enough fertility in it to support that new grass growth when it germinates and begins to grow. You can gauge if that seed bed is firm enough by how deep your footprints are. If you walk across a seed bed that you're looking to establish in the turf grass and you create a footprint that's deeper than a ½ inch deep, then maybe it's a little bit soft and it may need to be firmed up some. Well, how do you firm it up? You do it with a roller, okay, a weighted roller. You can rent these down at the equipment rental stores. Some folks have them. There are pull types that you can pull behind a lawnmower, a yard tractor, other types that you can push. Very often you can fill them with water and to add weight to them so that you can increase the amount of compaction that you are able to achieve by firming up that surface. But the reason you need a relatively firm surface, planting surface, for these little grass seeds is because they are so small. They don't need to be buried very deeply. And if the soil is just really soft and loose and you create deep footprints by walking across it, some of those grass seeds might be buried a bit too deep when you plant them, and it may make it difficult for them to germinate and to come on up through that crust that may form. And also, if it's really fine, loose planting bed, it may have a tendency to want to crust more and make it more difficult, after it rains on it, et cetera, for those little grass seeds to pop through there. Another good thing about rolling is it can sometimes be a good form of exercise too. So that can come in handy for you as well, I guess. But it doesn't really matter what kind of roller you use. If you've got a soft planting surface as you're preparing that planting bed, you can firm it up just by rolling it and get it ready. Then when it comes to the time to plant the seed, okay, and that's how most people establish yards, and we'll talk about sodding and so on in a minute. But most people plant seed, and it doesn't matter how you put the seed out there. It can be done by hand. You can see the old black and white photograph here of a gentleman spreading seed by hand. There have been lots of acres of grass sown in the United States over the years by hand. Okay, but then you see all these other devices, the spreaders, the broadcast spreaders, the drop spreaders, etc. They can be hand propelled or human powered, or they can be pulled behind, a small tractor or yard tractor, whatever the case may be. It doesn't matter how you do it, just so long as you uniformly spread the appropriate amount of seed over the given area, because that's the key. You want to spread enough seed, and you want to spread it uniformly so that you get a good cover out there. Broadcast seeding is probably the most common way to do it. It's probably faster. To ensure that you have good uniform distribution of seed, you might consider applying half the seed traveling in one direction across the area that's going to be seeded, and then apply the other half traveling at a 90-degree angle to the first. And that way you kind of, you kind of mitigate some of the irregularities that spreader may have, et cetera. And you kind of help to ensure a more uniform distribution of seed when you're broadcasting out there. It's important that that grass seed touches the soil, that you have contact with bare soil. And you can see here that these little grass seeds are germinating, they're sprouting. They're not buried very deeply. You can see it there in the little green prills you see out there, those pellets. That's just fertilizer that hasn't dissolved yet. But those grass seeds need to contact the soil. So again, a roller can be a good tool to use after you broadcast those seeds, just to press the seed down into the surface of the soil to help improve that seed to soil contact, because that's going to be real important to help those seeds get the most germination possible. What about covering the seed with some kind of mulch after seeding on a new location, on a new seed bed? Straw mulch can be used. It doesn't take a lot of straw. You know, in a perfect world, a 50-pound bale of straw spread uniformly is enough to cover 1,000 square feet. If you cover it too deeply, then you're obstructing sunlight. It can slow down the germination process, and it can hinder those newly germinating seeds from getting the sunlight they need to start photosynthesizing, making some energy, and growing on up. So you can hinder germination by doing that. The ground is not going to be entirely covered so that you can't see any soil surface after you've applied the proper amount of straw over a new seed bed like that. It's not necessary to remove the straw once the grass seed starts to germinate. If you try to do that, you're just going to pull up little grass seedlings in the process. That straw is going to deteriorate over time. When you begin to mow it, if there's still any out there, you'll chop some of that up and you'll speed that decomposition process up. Now, it is very likely that you'll get some germination of other plant material if you do use straw as a mulch. Very typically is going to be whatever the source of the straw was. If it's wheat straw, you'll probably get a few wheat seedlings to germinate. If it's oat straw, you get some oat seedlings to germinate. That's not a real big deal though, because those are annual plants that are going to die anyway. But if you do see those, and you can see some picture here in this slide, some of the coarser textured grasses like wheat is popping up there amongst those grass seedlings. That's nothing to be real concerned about. It's going to die anyway. But the straw kind of serves as a cover to help keep moisture around those grass seedlings. That's the key. When the grass seed is planted, then it gets wet and starts to soak, imbibe moisture. And as that seed starts to swell, that initiates germination. And you don't want that seed to dry out until germination has completed. So holding or having that damp straw around it can help to ensure that it doesn't dry out as rapidly. It kind of improves germination. It can maybe help keep seed from floating off under some rain conditions. Straw, if it does get dry, if it blows away, that's fine. Just kind of rake it back into place. But it's not a real difficult thing to deal with. There are erosion control mats that are very helpful if you've got a sloping area that you're establishing grass on from seed. They're made of fine wood shavings called Excelsior. They can be glued on to a biodegradable netting, and these can be rolled out over the surface of the slope after the grass seed has been broadcast, after the seed has been planted, and they can be held in place with landscape stakes, or landscape spikes or sod spikes, etc., just to keep it from rolling up or from being pushed down, by wind or whatever the case may be. And it'll decompose over time. When it comes to planting the seed, the size of the seed influences how many pounds of seed are planted, per unit of area. And typically when you talk about lawn care operations or applications, then the unit of area is very often 1,000 square feet. And so seeding rates are expressed in pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet of area. So you can see in this slide, there's a lot of variation, a lot of difference in the size of the seed. You see tall fescue over here on the far left-hand side, and annual ryegrass, perennial ryegrass. Those seeds are very similar in size. But then you get over to zoysia grass. Look how much difference, how much smaller that zoysia grass seed is compared to the tall fescue or the ryegrasses. And then Kentucky bluegrass, it's small like zoysia grass. But then you get down to Bermuda grass. It's called hulled Bermuda grass. It had the outside coating of the hull knocked off of it. Look how small that is in comparison to those great big seed like tall fescue. Now, we look at tall fescue seed, well, that's small. It is, but it's all relative. Tall fescue seed compared to Bermuda grass seed is a great big seed. Bermuda grass is very tiny. So the size of the seed influences how many seed are in a pound, and that influences what the seeding rate is. So to give you an idea of the difference in the sizes, the picture shows it, but here, I think this drives it home a little bit better. Bermuda grass with it's unhulled, so it still has the hull on it, got about 1.6 million seed per pound. The hulled seed has about 2.1 million seed per pound. That's a lot of grass seed in a pound, 2.1 million. I don't know who counted that, but they should get a raise, I guess, for doing that. You compare that to tall fescue, 230, so roughly 250,000 seed in a pound of tall fescue compared to over 2 million seed in a pound of Bermuda grass. Again, that influences what the suggested seeding rates are of those grasses, because there is so much difference in the number of seed in a given pound. When you're looking at buying grass seed, I mentioned earlier that very often you're going to see them packaged as blends. So here's an example of what I was talking about. This is one of the Rebel Southern Classic Tall Fescue Blend. You can look on here. It has 4 different tall fescue varieties listed there. It's got Rebel 4 Tall Fescue, Rebel Advanced Tall Fescue, Rebel Exceeda Tall Fescue, and Rebel Pro Tall Fescue. Those are the different 4 different varieties or cultivars of tall fescue that are packaged together in that bag of Rebel Southern Classic Tall Fescue seed. The origin over there, that's the state where this was grown. It's grown in Oregon. Most of the cool season grasses are grown in the Pacific Northwest. Also on the label, you'll see if there's any other crop seed listed or any other crop seed in the package. By law, it's required for those things to be included there. Inert matter, 0.5%. That's just other stuff. It's not seed. It's just maybe trash, etc., chaff, and so on, just from the cleaning and the packaging process and so on. 0.05% weed seed. If there were any noxious weeds in there, weeds that are considered to be noxious, then they would be identified. Not only the quantity that's there, but also they would be named as to what they are. So this bag of seed, according to the tag on the label, that's 0.05% of the volume is weed seed, but they're not noxious weeds, are not identified. If they were noxious weeds, they would have to be identified. And typically it would tell how many of, say, for example, red sheep sorrel seed there were per pound of the tall fescue seed. That's how that would be labeled on there. Other crop seed, that could be, for example, there might be some orchard grass seed mixed in with that tall fescue. It doesn't have to be named because it is not a noxious seed. It's not a noxious plant, but other crop seed, very small percentage. It's not uncommon to get a little bit of something like, say, orchard grass in some tall fescue seed, because they're both cool season grasses, and it's just incredibly hard to keep a pure stand, even these seed production fields, to keep a pure stand of just tall fescue out there, because birds can travel and drop seed in, etc. It can be moved on equipment, even though folks try to do a super good job of cleaning equipment and they move from field to field. Sometimes those other plants can be introduced in there, so that's a possibility. Another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at grass seed is you'll see coated seed advertised. Okay, so is a coated seed better than a non-coated seed? I don't know. They both grow, they both germinate, produce plants. But something to keep in mind, though, is the coating has weight, okay? And that influences the number of seed per pound there is always going to be fewer seed per pound of a coated seed versus a naked or a non-coated seed. And if you'll look right here on this one, and this is Scott's Turf Builder Grass Seed Southern Gold Mix, it has 3 different varieties of tall fescue included. Well, look at the percentages: 17.6%, 0.06%, 17.06%, and 14.62% tall fescue seed. 50% of the weight is the Water Smart coating. So there is way fewer seed per pound of this coated seed than there is the naked seed. That's fine and good. You just have to keep that in mind when you are calculating your seeding rates. Okay, and this is a 7-pound bag. It says that bag right there could treat roughly 1,750 square feet. So that's just something to keep in mind. You buy a bag of coated seed thinking that it's going to cover the same amount of area that non-coated seed, and it's not going to do it. So you just have to remember that. So what are the seeding rates on these different varieties, or these different species? On the fescues, that's the fine fescues up to the tall fescues. The fine fescues are more than that 5 pounds per 1,000 square foot seeding rate. The tall fescue, more than 8 pound per 1,000 square foot of seeding. Kentucky bluegrass, 1.5 to 2 pounds per 1,000. Perennial ryegrass, 4 to 6 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet. Conversely, compare it to Bermuda grass and the centipede and the zoysia grass on the warm season side. Bermuda grass, 1/2 to 1 pound per 1,000 square feet. Centipede grass, anywhere from 1/2 to 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Zoysia grass, 1/2 to 3 pounds. Way more seed in a pound of those 3 warm season species than there are in those cool season varieties. That's why the seeding rates are so much lower for the warm season than they are for the cool season, simply because there's way more seed per pound. When you're getting ready to plant grass seed, you need to know how big the area is so you'll know how much to purchase. I guess every one of us can remember some teacher at some point in our school career saying, one day you'll use this. Well, and if that happened to be in geometry and the teacher was talking about formulas to calculate area, different shapes and so on, then he or she was right, because this is a case where you could use some of that geometry formula to calculate the square footage area of a lawn in order to calculate how much grass seed to buy. So these different formula are out there, and you can measure, use a tape measure and somebody to hold one end of it, or a screwdriver to use to anchor one end of it in the ground, and you can get length and width and so on and do your calculations. But another option is, if you can identify the area to be planted from an aerial photograph, there are some online services that will, so long as you can identify the area from an aerial photograph, you can mark the boundaries and it'll calculate the area for you. So, this is my front yard at my house here in Rockville, Tennessee. And I've used this. This is from Sod Solutions. That's a company that sells, sod, and they have a square footage calculator, and you can use it so many times free, per year to calculate area of different places. So I can identify, the front yard from the aerial photograph, and I plot the points out there, and this measures it for me. It tells me there's 15,263.52 square feet in that area. And there are other online tools out there that will help you measure area of lawn areas, just so long as you can identify the boundaries, the corners of the area in those aerial photographs. You've got to know how big the area that you're going to plant is, so you'll know how much seed to buy. That's just it. So once you plant that seed, how long is it going to take before it starts to come up and grow? So these are, this slide shows us approximate days to germinate after planting, and also the kind of preferred germination, the temperature that is going to enhance germination of those grass seed. Kentucky bluegrass, 14 to 21 or more days. It's kind of, you'll see this pattern, I think, that the smaller the grass seed, typically the longer it takes it to germinate. So preferred temperature anywhere from 59 to 86 degrees. That's soil temperature. That's a pretty wide range, but 14 to 21 days. Okay. Tall fescue, it's a larger seed than Kentucky bluegrass, 6 to 12 days. Typically, if you've got adequate moisture and that temperature in the 68 to 86 degree range, you expect tall fescue to germinate in 6 to 12 days or so. Typically you're going to say a week to 2 weeks. you expect to see germination on tall fescue if you've got adequate moisture and adequate temperature. It takes longer on the smaller seeds. Annual ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, 3 days to 7 days. Now, that's pretty darn fast. That's why, it's said that those ryegrasses germinate easily. They germinate readily. They just germinate so much faster than the other grasses do. Then you look at the warm season grass, or excuse me, the cool season grasses. When they germinate, that dictates when we plant those seeds. Okay, that dictates when we plant them. So here, we're using this same slide again to indicate the time to plant cool season grasses. This is the growth curve of the grasses. It grows really great in the springtime, grows great guns, and it slows down in the summertime. And then as we transition from summer into fall, the days get a little cooler, the nights get a little cooler, and that grass starts to grow again. But also the temperatures typically fall into the range that are going to encourage that grass seed to germinate. But also, we have these long periods when the temperature is going to be, above freezing, and allow that plant root to develop and get a good mature root on it before we transition through the wintertime into the hot weather of the following spring. So that grass planted, that cool season grass, that's the orchard, the tall fescue and the Kentucky bluegrass, the ryegrass, and so on. When it's planted in that fall, in that September, early October timeframe, has many, many days to develop a root system and get some maturity to it before we transition over into the hotter months of the late spring and the summer, which is going to be a stress for that grass. Now, are there environmental conditions, temperature, moisture in the spring of the year that would favor, seed germination? Yes, there are. I heard someone at a field day once ask the question, when's the best time to plant tall fescue? Someone in the crowd said September. And then they said, okay, when's the second best time to plant tall fescue? They said next September. Well, there's probably a fair amount of truth to that, but in reality, the second best time to plant, I guess, if you can't get planted in the fall of the year, is going to be early springtime. Typically you're talking about as early in March as you can get it out there. But when you plant that in March, you're going to have moisture. Usually you have adequate moisture and temperatures that will favor seed germination, but you don't have as many days of growing before you get into the heat of the late spring and early summertime. So that grass, that cool season grass, is not as mature. It doesn't have as well-developed root system that can maybe help it survive the stresses of the hot weather months. That's why that September to early October is the preferred planting time. That's the recommended planting time for those cool season grasses. Looking at warm season grasses, the number of days to germinate on Bermuda grass, Hull Bermuda grass, 10 to 20 days or more. 65 to 90 degree temperature, preferred germination temperature. Zoysia grass, 10 to 14 days. Centipede grass, 10 to 20 plus days. And they all like it in that 65 low to 90 degree high range to germinate. So they germinate in warm weather. So when do we plant that grass? We plant it at the same time it'll be growing. We want to be past the danger of frost. So we're looking then at, probably after the end of April, the first part of May, up through the month of June to plant those warm season grasses from seed. And we like to get them in early enough in the summer so they have time to grow and develop and get some maturity on those young seedlings and develop a root system so that they're able to withstand the stresses of fall and winter when their growth period slows down. Just like the like the cool season grasses can be damaged by hot weather, warm season grasses can be damaged by cold weather if they don't have enough maturity to withstand, the cold temperatures during that first year of establishment. So you get them planted earlier in the year in that May to June time frame, gives them more time to grow and develop and get some maturity and development to them before we transition over into the fall when that growth rate is going to slow down. So that's why then that May, June is the recommended time for planting warm season grass from seed here in Tennessee. I mentioned broadcast seeding is the most common way to do it. There are other ways to do it. There are machines out there called slit seeders. They act like little drills. Basically, they're more commonly used to interseed or to add seed into an existing turf. But this slide here shows you an example of the Clausen brand slit seeder. You'll see in the picture on the left, or excuse me, on the right, it's kind of raised up and you can see a set of blades underneath the machine. Those blades are vertical blades mounted to a horizontal shaft. And when that thing is operating, those blades are spinning, and you can adjust how deeply those blades cut into the soil surface. So they cut into the surface, they cut slits into the ground. That's why it's called a slit seeder. The front of the device itself has a seed box on it. You put the seed in there, you adjust it, you open it up, you move this machine across the ground, it's dropping the seed out of the front of it, and then those blades are opening those slits up and helping to cut that seed into those slits into the surface of the soil there. So you're getting seed to soil contact. So you're kind of planting the seed and cultivating the ground in one operation, working like a little planter or a no-till drill. Again, like I said, that's typically used more on overseeding into existing turf, but it can be used on a brand new, newly established turf as well. For larger areas, there are tractor-mounted machines that do the same thing. Here's an example of a land pride slit seeder. Works like a little no-till drill. These devices, they do plant the seed into rows. So on a bunch grass, it's going to take that a little while for those bunches to grow big enough so that you don't see the rows anymore. So a way to mitigate that is to plant half the seed going in one direction, plant the other half the seed going in a diagonal direction to it. So you break that row pattern up some. It's not as obvious. It doesn't matter. I mean, it'll eventually all grow together, but that just helps it to look fuller, faster, I guess, takes away that row appearance to it. Sodding is the next option, I guess, for establishing a new lawn. Sodding is typically used. Well, I mean, with sod, you get an instant cover, okay, because you are planting actively growing turf grass when you lay it out there. Okay, it's actively growing. Now, those are typically utilized in areas where irrigation is available because that you've got a valuable good right there. You've got a perishable product. That grass was cut from the field where it was growing. It's got a little layer of soil. It's got a root layer with it, and that sod has got to grow roots down into its new home as quickly as possible in order for it to start pulling nutrients and moisture out of the ground and start then the growth process to grow in and to fill in and to start producing above ground shoots, so that it can start creating its own energy and keep that growing cycle over. So because it is so valuable, you're going to pay way more for sod than you are for seed. That's why it's most commonly used on sites that do have access to irrigation to help improve survivability. Sod is a perishable good. So in a perfect world, it would be installed within 48 hours after it's harvested. Sod comes either in square cut slabs or on pallets, or it comes in round rolls. Sod in the square cut slabs, they should be laid in a brick-like pattern so that you don't have very large noticeable seams. It would appear to me that in this slide, the folks that were laying the sod can maybe have gotten down on their hands and knees and maybe push those pieces together a little bit. Now, that's easy for me to say. I'm not down on my hands and knees doing that. I have laid sod. It's not the most pleasant thing in the world. If you do a good job, you're going to get your back into it, and you want those seams to touch so that you don't have wide open gaps where those pieces are not exactly touching one another. The reason for that is those edges, you've got exposed roots there. The edges, the roots can dry out. You can get some browning on the edges of those pieces where the seams aren't, where you don't have a good tight seam. And plus, you've got exposed native soil there. If you've got any weed seed like crabgrass, etc., in that native soil, it can germinate because it's exposed to the sun. And in those cracks, those seams, open seams there, you can see some crabgrass germinating. You can see the white arrow pointing to it right there. That's a crabgrass seedling that's germinated in that seam because those pieces of sod weren't pushed together. That's why it's so important to have a good tight seam when you're laying the sod. The thing about roll sod, you've got fewer edges, so you have fewer seams. And it's easier, you don't have as many pieces to worry about. Now, with square cut sod on a slab, on a pallet of square cut sod, that thing's gonna weigh about a ton. The individual pieces are of a size that you can have it delivered to your site and you can lay it out there. Anybody can do it as long as they're physically able perform the task of picking those pieces of sod up, putting them in the ground, packing them together, etc. You don't need special equipment to do that. For the rolls, though, especially the large rolls, you do need special equipment. Those rolls are very heavy. It takes a machine to unroll those. But the advantages are it can be done maybe a little faster, less physical labor on the installer's part, and plus there are fewer seams to deal with, so you don't have to worry about as many places meeting and touching and having those exposed edges. Plugging is another option to vegetatively propagate, to establish a new turf. And like I mentioned at the beginning, a plug is nothing more than a small piece of sod. Okay, more than 300 2-inch by 2-inch square or plugs can be cut from a square yard of sod. I'm going to back up. One thing I forgot to mention is on the square cut sod. I said a pallet weighs about a ton. Well, a pallet of square cut sod will cover about 500 square feet or so. Okay, 450, 500 square feet. That's about how much area that pallet of sod will cover. So when the plugging only works on creeping grasses. Okay, the idea is because you take advantage of that creeping habit. The idea is you plant the plug and you plant those plugs so you can space them apart so it doesn't take as much plant material to cover the area. Well, you're not actually covering it, but because the grass does creep and spread, you're going to encourage its growth to take advantage of that so it doesn't take as much plant material to establish the grass cover on a given area. Now, it's the closer you put those plugs together, typically the faster it will cover. The further apart you space those plugs, then it's going to take longer to get a good dense cover of turf out there. A very common spacing is 6 inches by 6 inches. But you can see here the plugs are planted and now they've been established and they're beginning to grow. You can see that lateral growth of the stolons above ground. What we don't see is the growth of the rhizomes below ground, but we've got to get the top of the ground covered, okay, because the longer that ground remains uncovered on the surface, then the better chance there is for weeds and other plants to grow in there that we don't necessarily want to grow and compete with in the grass. So after planting, regardless of whether you have sowed the grass, you planted it via seed, you have sodded it, you have plugged it in, etc. It's going to take water. It takes water for the new seed to germinate. It takes water to encourage the roots on sod to go down. Okay, for those roots from that layer of sod start reaching down into the soil and establishing themselves there. On plugs, again, it takes that moisture for them to start to grow those roots and develop out there. If it were sprig, okay, it takes moisture for those sprigs to start to produce roots at the nodes and for them to start to spread laterally out across the surface of the ground. From a seeding standpoint, if you're going to sprinkle the grass, if you sprinkle the area with an irrigation system or a hose-in sprinkler, whatever the case you're using, the idea is not to wet the ground deeply, but it's to keep the surface of the soil damp where the seed is so that it doesn't dry out and you get it to germinate. So in a perfect world, you're going to sprinkle it every day. Now, I guess in a perfect world, you can sprinkle it a couple of times a day just to keep that upper soil surface down. Once it starts to germinate and you get good germination, then you cut down on how often you water it, but you increase the length of the irrigation period so that the water begins to move deeper into the soil and encourage those roots to move down there. The same thing is true, from a sodded lawn area. Initially you want to keep the upper soil surface damp so that those roots begin to move down. But once that sod starts to take hold, okay, and you can feel, you pull up on a little bit and it resists. That tells you you've got roots that are growing down into the soil. Then you cut back on how maybe not watering every day, but you're watering for a longer period so that you're pushing that water or allowing that water to soak in deeper, down there 6 inches, 7 inches, 8 inches deep into the soil. When you start mowing newly established grass, well, when it needs mowing, okay, that's when you start. Typically, if you're going to maintain, grass at 3 inches tall, when it reaches 4 inches, it's time to cut an inch off the top of it. The goal is to not cut a super amount off at any one time, but when it's tall enough to begin to be mowing, that's when you start mowing. Just make sure you got a good sharp mower blade. What about fertilization? During the establishment process, you would have mixed in your fertilizer and so on in that seed bed as you're preparing that. But then after the grass begins to germinate and grow, if you've got 6 weeks of good growing conditions after the grass has been established, then it's certainly going to benefit from the application of additional fertilizer. Carla, do you want to take a little break right now? We've been going probably for an hour and 15 minutes or so. Do you want to give folks a chance to stretch their legs a minute, and then we can proceed with the rest of it? Or I'm at your discretion here.
Yes, it would be good to have a break right now.
Okay.
Okay.
How long you want to break?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. So at
All right.
7:30, I'll start back.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Carla, we ready to get started back?
Yes, I believe we are. I don't see any questions in the chat. Do you all here in person have any questions right now?
One.
Okay, we got one.
What was the difference between mixture and blend? Again?
What was the difference between a mixture and a blend?
A mixture is 2 or more species of turf grass combined in the same package. And a blend is 2 or more cultivars of the same species combined in the same package.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right.
I would have thought the question would be, how much longer is he going to go?
How much longer is it gonna go?
How much longer is he going to go? So hopefully, nobody has hurt themselves falling out of
No,
the chair.
they wouldn't.
I mean, you're not opening that specifically, but like that's kind of what the same as opposed to like, so if you wouldn't talk fescue as opposed to.
Right.
Everything multiple tall fescues, right?
Right, I think, okay. I'm confused there, but yeah, it wouldn't be a blend of cool season and warm season together, right? Okay.
I get that. I just meant for-
No, that's what you call a mess. If you
That's
have-
what you call a mess. Yeah. So it would be blends of types of turf type
So,
tall
okay,
fescue,
good. So like,
Yeah.
Zoysia and Bermuda.
right, or zoysia and Bermuda, I guess. They probably wouldn't mix, that'd be a mess too.
Yeah, it was always in Bermuda. I mean, you're not going to find a package together. So you're not going to find them mixed together in the same package.
Just gonna check the-
Because they grow alike, you might grow them together on the same piece of ground because they're both warm season grasses. So they grow at the same time of the year, et cetera. But a warm season grass and a cool season grass, since you've got a dormant period for a warm season grass and a very vigorous growth period for a cool season grass, there are going to be times during the year when the warm season is dormant and the cool season is growing aggressively. And so you've got, the patch you look like we saw on the slide there had the striped yard.
Mhm.
We had dormant Bermuda and growing tall fescue. Okay.
Yeah, I've been dealing with that question a lot because people are trying to renovate their turf, which, our droughty summer did kill out a lot of the turf.
Yes.
And it's still
Yeah.
so dry. I mean, we just got the rain today a little bit.
And that's the thing.
How-
This was a tough fall to plant grass. And
Yeah.
I mean, I met with folks today about the very thing. And, well, is it too late? Is it too late? Man, I don't know. I don't know what the weather's going to do. I don't know what the weather's going to do. I will say this, as long as you leave the seed in the bag, it will not come up. Okay.
It was-
But are you wasting your money to put it out there now? I have seen some very successful fall establishments of tall fescue that were made in November, early November. Okay. I think back to 2016, we had that big long dry spell. That was the year of the fires in Gatlinburg and so on. And that really, really dry, hot fall. So I saw a break in the weather forecast and it called for rain on September the 16th. Okay. I planted grass seed the day before tall fescue. Well, it didn't rain until the 1st of November after I planted that grass seed. I got a fair amount of germination and got a pretty decent population of tall fescue out of it. So it's a gamble. Anytime you plant a seed, it's a gamble. It's either going to come up or it won't. Those are the only 2 choices. It'll either come up or it won't.
You
have
50-50 shot.
we have the recommended times of planting to kind of improve the odds as much as possible in our favor. But when conditions, I mean, it doesn't matter if the calendar says it's time to plant grass, that's fine and good. If you don't have any water, it don't matter. It don't matter. So you got to, you pay your money, you take your chances sometimes. I don't know a better way to say it.
Okay.
All right, we're going to continue on.
Okay.
All right, so now we've got this grass, hopefully got it up and growing, so we're going to take care of it. So let's talk about some different maintenance aspects of grass. So when we're thinking about maintaining a home lawn, when you're talking about maintaining turf grass, we're basically looking at three primary areas. We're looking at maintaining the above ground portion. That's the aerial shoots, but also, especially on your sod forming grass, your creeping grass like zoysia and Bermuda grass, they can form a thatch layer. But we also have to manage the below ground part too, where the roots and the rhizomes are. All right, so all three of those come into play as we talk about maintaining turf grasses. So this is a list of turf grass maintenance practices. And you'll see the top three are called primary practices. Then we have supplementary practices. The primary practices are called primary because we do them more often than we do the supplementary practices. So let's get started with the primary practice. The first one up there is mowing. Hopefully your mowing experiences are maybe better than what this fellow right here has experienced. But mowing is that one thing that we're probably going to do more frequently than any other practice out there. Some folks look forward to mowing because they've got a nice population of turf grass and it allows them to express their artistic side, and they can create some very attractive patterns in the yard by striping and so on. You know, and sometimes I've had folks ask, well, how do you make those stripes in the yard? Well, it's not hard. You need two things to do it. Okay, first, you need a good population of grass. You know, weeds don't stripe so well, but a good population of turf grass, you can stripe it. And then second, you need something that's going to push the grass in alternate directions. So to stripe grass, you just mow it in alternate directions. You mow one direction and you're going to push the grass in such a way that the upper leaf surface is more exposed to the sun. It reflects light back a little bit differently than the lower leaf surface or the bottom portion of the leaf surface. So you mow in one direction and you kind of push the bulk of the grass over so that the upper leaf surface is more visible. So it reflects light back in a different way, sunlight back. Then you turn around and come back in the opposite direction right beside that, and you're exposing more of the lower leaf surface, and it reflects light back a little differently, so you get dark light stripes. Now, the more the more you can get that grass to lay over in one direction versus the other, then you're going to get typically a deeper striping effect. There are striping kits that can be purchased or made to attach to mowers, and they can be rollers that will roll the grass. You know, when you roll it across there, you're going to match the grass over so that the upper surface is exposed. Then you come the opposite direction, you're going to expose the lower surface because you're rolling it the opposite direction. They may have stiff brushes on there, but just anything to help enhance that pushing the grass in one direction versus the other as you alternate mowing directions back and forth. If you want to checkerboard it, you know, then you mow it all and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then you come back at right angles to the first direction and do it again. It takes twice as long. You know, in this example here, these folks have cut, you know, like alternating arcs, curves into it. So it looks like they have cut it twice. So it takes twice as long to do that, but it can look pretty cool. Anyway, when do we mow grass? We mow it when it's actively growing. So for our cool season grasses, you know, we've got a big mowing growth spurt in the spring of the year, boom, 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 you know, March and April. Typically cool season grasses take off in March, they start growing. So we really got to start mowing them then. We go through April and May and into June. Very often in July, it starts to get hot. The growth rate may slow down. August, we may not have to mow very much on cool season grasses. September, depending on how much moisture there is, you may not mow much. And if there's not enough moisture, you won't mow anytime, right? It's got to have moisture to grow. But temperature wise, you move it in the fall, it starts to grow again. And so our mowing pattern picks up. We can mow cool season grasses, you know, sometimes even into December. So the mowing season on cool season grass is much longer than that on warm season grasses. Conversely, the warm season grasses are not really going to start growing much until the ground gets warm enough in the spring of the year for them to break dormancy. Very often that's going to be middle of April or later. And then I backed up there. Then we're going to have a peak mowing season during the warm months of the year. And then as we transition over into the fall, out of the summertime, days get shorter, grass starts growing slower, and we, you know, ultimately it's going to come a frost and that grass is going to go dormant and we can park the lawnmower, you know, winterize it, put it away sooner for warm season grasses than you do on the cool season grasses, unless you're one of the individuals that wants that green color year round, and then you overseed it with ryegrass, your Bermuda grass or the ryegrass, say at the end of August, early part of September, and that way you can pretty well mow 12 months out of the year. But anyway, that's when we mow. Now, all these grasses, people ask, does mowing stress the grass? Absolutely, it does. Yes, it does. Mowing damages the grass because when you cut off leaf blades, you're cutting off sunlight receptors. The sunlight receptors, the grass uses the leaf blade as a receptor to catch sunlight. It uses sunlight to photosynthesize to make its own energy. So every time you cut portions of the grass blades off, you're knocking away some of those sunlight receptors. And so you force the grass then to use some of the energy that it has stored in the root system to regrow new leaf tissue so that it can start catching more sunlight again and start creating energy versus storing energy. Now, all these grasses that we use as turf grasses have been selected because they have demonstrated over the years that they can tolerate regular defoliation and still survive, assuming we don't cut them off too short. So there's a mowing height recommended for every species of grass out there. And the goal is to try to maintain that grass within that recommended mowing height so that we can minimize stress and maintain a good dense turf grass population out there. So this slide shows you what the recommended mowing heights are for the different grasses under good growing conditions and versus under the poor growing conditions. On the cool season grasses, good growing conditions are cool, humid weather. Poor growing conditions are hot, dry weather. On the warm season grasses, the warm, moist conditions are good growing weather. The cold, dry conditions are the poor growing season. You'll see in the fescues, the chewing fescue, the fine fescue, good growing conditions, 1 to 2 inches. Tall fescue, good growing conditions, 2 to 3 inches. I personally don't really know anybody here in our part of the world that maintains tall fescue much below 3 inches. So my experience has been that I have a little bit of success by maintaining on the higher side of that recommended cutting height. So I typically don't go below 3 inches on tall fescue. And then when conditions are not as favorable for above ground growth, that's when you start raising mowing height up. And that's true for any cool season grass or warm season grass. When you get out of good growing conditions and poor growing conditions, that's when you start raising it up because you want to alleviate some of the stress, reduce some of the stress on that grass. There are times that you're going to stop mowing at all because the grass is not growing. You're causing more damage to run a lawnmower across it than you are by just leaving it alone. You look here at the Kentucky bluegrass, 1.5, 2.25 inches. Typically, you're going to see, not typically, I mean just every time, those sod forming grasses and finer texture grasses will tolerate closer mowings than will the coarser texture grasses. Kentucky bluegrass, finer texture, creeping grass, 1.5, 2.25 inches under good growing conditions. Tall fescue, 3 inches under good growing conditions. Big difference there in those mowing heights. Then we look at the warm season grasses, Bermuda grass, the common types, and when it says common type, that's referring to seeded varieties, typically in the 1 to 2 inch range. The hybrid Bermuda grasses in the 3/4 to 1.5 inches. You can really mow those hybrid Bermuda grasses down very, very close. Most people don't have a yard flat enough to mow that short. They're going to be scalping areas because you've got minor elevation changes across the yard. It's got a little bit of bumps and so on to it. You just can't mow that close. 3/4 of an inch, you're talking about almost tabletop flat. But you look at the mowing heights, and these are listed in your chapter there on turf grass management. I don't expect you to try to remember all this, but typically not typically, but the creeping grasses you can mow at a shorter height of cut than you can the bunch grasses. And for tall fescue, 3 inches on the short side, and then when it gets hot and dry, then you raise that mowing height on up. The Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, you can cut those guys down pretty low if you got good flat ground when you got good growing conditions. There is a correlation between the amount of growth, amount of tissue, shoots you have above ground and roots below ground. And I think this slide does an excellent job of illustrating that. These are perennial ryegrass plants. And you can see on the far left, the grass is being maintained at in this picture, the tallest height of cut, and look at how much root development you have compared to the one on the far right side that's being maintained at a much lower height of cut. You have much diminished root mass in there. So there's a direct correlation. That's why people that continually mow grass too short wind up with dead grass areas, because they literally force it to use up all its own energy, and they destroy the root system. Remember, we're managing, when we're cutting that above ground portion, we're having an impact on that root zone below ground. So there's a correlation between the amount of tissue above ground that's catching sunlight and creating energy to form those roots that are going to reach down there in that ground, pull the nutrients out, pull the water out of the ground, etc. So maintain, you want to mow at the correct height. You want to mow often enough so that you, in a perfect world, remove no more than 1/3 of the average plant height at a time. It's been found over the years that if you can kind of follow that 1/3 rule, that you're going to minimize the amount of stress that you place on the grass. It will tolerate removing on a regular basis 1/3 or less of its length at a time. You know what? Sometimes though, the world doesn't cooperate. It rains, you get busy, mowers break down, you can't get it cut. And so then you come back and you cut it, you create all these clippings out there. Clippings are not bad. So the only time the clippings are bad is when you generate enough clippings so you create a layer of clippings that is so thick that it will obstruct sunlight from reaching the surface of the grass plants. That creates a damp, moist environment where organisms like fungi and so on can grow. They can cause disease problems on the grass, and plus you're blocking sunlight off. So as long as you're able to mow the grass and you create clippings to the point that you don't make those thick piles that block sunlight, it's perfectly fine to allow the clippings to remain on the surface of the grass. You're recycling the nutrients that are available, that are contained in those grass clippings. You're allowing that organic matter to remain out there, decompose, to add to the organic matter content of the soil where that grass is growing in the first place. It's not a bad idea to change direction from mowing from one time to the next, or at least periodically. In a perfect world, you're not going to mow when the ground is really, really wet, because wet soil compacts more readily than does dry soil. The creeping grasses like Bermuda grass and zoysia grass and so on, we can encourage them to develop grain, or the grass kind of grow in a given direction, the above ground shoots in a given direction, if we continuously mow them in the same direction. That's probably not that big a deal for a home lawn, but for an athletic field, where, example, ball roll comes into play, like on a golf course or on a baseball field, where you try to anticipate, how's the ball going to bounce, a ground ball, etc. The grain can influence how that ball rolls. That's more of a big deal on those fields than it is on a home lawn. But it's not a bad idea to change direction of your mowing directions every once in a while. When it comes down to lawnmower technology, I put this slide in here just to show that even though appearances have changed, the technology that we use to cut grass has not changed hardly at all from these two old ads of lawnmowers here. On the left, we've got a rotary mower. On the right, we have a reel mower. Today, we use those same types of mowers for mowing. Okay, they may have more bells and whistles, they may be bigger, stronger, faster, that kind of thing, but we're still using rotary mowers, or we also have available to us reel mowers to use today, and that part has not changed. So rotary mowers are by far the most commonly used lawn mowers today. They come in a variety of sizes, both the walk behind, the push type, the ride-ons. They're called rotary mowers because they have blades that are mounted, onto a shaft underneath the mower deck. And these blades are spinning and they're going around in a circle, so they're rotary. And the ends of the blades are the sharp portions, and they're cutting the grass as they spin around there. So they have the ability to cut all manner of plant growth, all manner of material, whether it's fine grass or grass and weed combinations. They'll chop up water hoses, kids' toys, dog toys. If you run over the little trees that you put out, it'll chop those up too. So those are maybe some of the downsides on those. What are some of the drawbacks of the rotary mowers? They don't make as clean a cut. They don't provide the cleanest cut out there as compared to a reel type mower. And we'll point that out here in just a second. But I mentioned the striping kits. Here's a couple of examples of striping kits that are added on to these. You can see this one on the riding mower on the left-hand side. It's just basically more like a brush to kind of push the grass in one direction as you go, as you mow down, and then push it in the opposite direction when you come back. And then the walk behind mower on the right-hand side, it's got a roller kit that attaches to it that helps create those stripes. Then the reel mowers, that's the other choice that we have available today. The reel mowers provide the finest cut out there. They cut more like a pair of scissors compared to the rotary mower, which cuts by just the blade spinning around and around, and basically it just kind of clips off the ends of the grass blades. It doesn't work like a pair of scissors does. The reel mower works like a pair of scissors because this reel that you see up here, okay, in the upper right hand corner of the slide, that reel turns and it has blades on that reel, but that's not really the cutting. Those blades aren't really what's doing the cutting. The cutting is done by a stationary blade called a bed knife that is down here on the bottom of the mower. But you can't really see it in these pictures. But as that reel turns forward, it pulls those grass blades against that stationary knife blade, and it clips like a pair of scissors. So it provides by far the cleanest cut, the sharpest, most distinct cut out there. So that's a very positive thing, I guess. The downside of it is that typically these are they don't have a very wide cutting width, so it takes longer to cut a given area. Some of these are human powered, and it does take energy, human energy to do that. They do a better job of cutting grass than they do weeds or grass that's been allowed to produce seed heads, etc. But they can be good choices, though. They can do an excellent job of cutting, and you can have motorized versions of it. There are tow behind models that are used to cut wide areas, etc. A sharp mower blade provides the cleanest cut. Here you can see the jagged ends of these grass blades. They were cut by a dull mower blade, reducing leaf damage. By keeping a sharp mower blade, you can reduce leaf damage and the potential for disease by making a cleaner cut. The more jagged that edge is on the end of the leaf blade, the more surface area is exposed. There's more area there for water to leave the plant, and that's why you'll see after grass has been cut with a dull blade, after a day or so, it kind of take this little brown haze look across the surface of it, because all those leaf tips have turned brown out there because of that damage, and they become desiccated due to water loss and so on. So those are larger wounds then that disease pathogens can enter into them and so on. And it doesn't look very good. So I have to ask this question when I see things like this: are you cutting the grass or are you beating it into submission when you cut it with a dull mower blade? So the point is, sharpen the mower blade so you don't have this appearance. Mowing dulls blades, and you have to sharpen them typically more than once during the growing season. I can't tell you how often to do it. You just got to look at the appearance of the grass. It will tell you. But you don't want to have this kind of appearance out there. You want a nice clean cut, as clean as possible. So the next thing up on our primary maintenance program is fertilization. There are, about 19 different nutrients that are essential for plant growth, and you can see them listed here. Some charts will show, 18, 16, 18 the different nutrients that are essential for plant growth. 3 of those are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are supplied by soil and water, or by air and water, and then the others are supplied through the soil system itself. You got your primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, then secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and then our micronutrients. They're all essential, okay? One's just as important as the other. Those nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they're called micronutrients or primary nutrients because they're used in the greatest quantity compared to all the others. The secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, they are next in the quantity being used, but they're no less important than the primary nutrients are. As the micronutrients are no less important than the primary nutrients are, they're just used in very, very small quantities, and very often native soils will contain enough of those micronutrients to supply the plant needs of the turf grass, so that it's not necessary to provide them via supplemental fertilization. So the key to a good soil or a good turfgrass fertility program is to have a good soil sample, to have it tested so you'll know what's there. Okay, and the key to a good soil test is a good soil sample, and a good sample is one that's representative of the area that you're going to manage as a lawn area. And you're not going to get that by going out to one spot in that yard and digging down 6 inches and taking that 6-inch sample out and saying, boom, there's my sample. You want to go to multiple locations across the yard and take samples from each of those locations, 6 inches deep, and mix those together to create a composite sample of the area that you're managing as a lawn. So you do that, you get something to dig with, a bucket to put soil in, a plastic bucket works great. You go to your first spot, you dig 6 inch deep, drop that soil over into the bucket, go to the next spot, zigzagging back and forth across the front, side, the back of the yard, mix it all together. Takes about a cup and a half of soil to send to the UT soil testing laboratory to get a good test. The UT soil lab is not the only one out there. It doesn't matter which one you use, just use a soil lab to get that fertility test done. So then you can develop a good fertility program. Here's what a soil test report looks like. If you use the University of Tennessee soil test lab, it will come back to you. It's going to tell you what soil pH is, what the amount of available phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, etc., that's available for those grass plants to utilize. And then it will have fertilization recommendations on there based on what's present in the soil. Okay. And if you've not had a soil test done, well, I would encourage you to do that because it can help you make the right choices. It can help you to avoid over-fertilization, help you avoid wasting nutrients, help you avoid wasting resources. It's not uncommon to run across soils because the way they've been managed over the years, that they can test high in phosphorus and potassium. And if they test high in phosphorus and potassium, there is no value to add additional phosphorus and potassium out there. You're wasting money and you're increasing the potential for some of those nutrients to be leached out of the water and wind up in the water supply or wind up in rivers and streams and cause some negative impacts there. So I encourage you to have a soil test done so that you can follow a good fertility program. Soil pH is one of those things that's measured, and you've probably talked about this already in your soils class. If you haven't had that yet, you will at some point. Soil pH is, it's a measure of alkalinity or acidity. And the reason it's important is that nutrients can be present in the soil. But because of the soil pH and the chemistry and the way it all works, and if we get much further down this road, then you'll be beyond my comprehension of things. But when that soil pH is where it needs to be for a given crop, in this case turfgrass, then those nutrients that are present in the soil are available in quantities sufficient to meet the needs of the plant. And then when the pH moves out of the range that's preferred by that crop, in this case turfgrass to be grown, then the nutrients may be present in the soil, but they're not available for the plant to utilize. Or the other potential is they can become so available that they can you can almost have a toxic environment there, where they are available to the point that it's too available. You could have, for example, molybdenum toxicity or aluminum toxicity or something like that. So that's the reason that soil test is important. Know where that soil pH is to help make sure that the nutrients that are in the soil are available for the plants to utilize. That's what soil pH does. Soil pH, if the soil is acid, then you adjust it by adding a base to it. The most common base material utilized is limestone. Limestone can be pelleted like you see right here, or it can be pulverized. Either one is fine. It's the same stuff. The pelleted is just the pulverized that's been glued together to make pellets out of it. It's cleaner to spread. It's not as dusty, etc. The inverse of that, or the opposite of that, is soil that is too basic. Okay, that has a pH above 7. Anything 7, 7 is neutral on the pH scale. Anything below 7 is acid. Anything above 7 is alkaline. So if the soil is too alkaline, too far above 7, then it needs to be acidified a little bit. And most of all of our turf grasses like a little bit of acid soil. So they like a pH in the 6.1 to 7 range. So if soil needs to be acidified, then a common acid to add to that soil to make it more to acidify is sulfur. Here's granular sulfur. It could be powdered sulfur. Again, just like the pelleted limestone versus the pulverized limestone. Granular sulfur is neater, easier to spread. It's not as dusty, not as messy as powdered sulfur is. We feed turf grasses when they're growing. Okay, so for cool season grasses, the spring of the year, the fall of the year is when they're going to respond to the application of fertilizers. That's the ideal time to make those fertilizer applications, is in the spring of the year and in the fall of the year. Conversely, warm season grasses are growing in the hot weather months. So we don't fertilize them in the winter time. We don't fertilize them late in the fall. We don't fertilize them early in the spring because they're not growing and they cannot utilize that fertilizer out there. So it's important to apply, to make these applications at the time when the plant can utilize it. So warm season grasses, we're talking about April, June, July, September, that kind of time frame. Cool season grasses, we're talking maybe March, maybe a little in April, then again in the fall of the year, September, October, November. Those are the times that those grasses can best utilize those fertilizer applications. You look at a fertilizer label, it tells you a lot about what's in that fertilizer package. The numbers on here, the analysis, okay, that can be referred to as the analysis. Those numbers are percentages, and they represent the percentages of those 3 primary nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. You see here the nitrogen, the N for green leafy growth, the P, that's the middle one, phosphorus, it's in the fertilizer in the form of phosphate, okay? It's for root and bud growth, etc. Potash, or the third one, it's represented by the letter K, okay, and it's in the form of potash, but potash contains potassium. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's what those 3 numbers are. Always in that order: nitrogen first, phosphorus second, potassium third. Potassium is important for drought tolerance, for disease resistance, for hardiness, etc. And those numbers, like on this example, this is the co-op fertilizer, Tennessee Farmers Co-op, 24-4-12. It's 24% nitrogen, 4% phosphate or phosphorus, 12% potash. That's the percentage. Okay, so in 100 pounds of that fertilizer material, there'll be 24 pounds of nitrogen, 4 pounds of phosphorus, 12 pounds of potassium. Some fertilizers are called complete fertilizers, some are called incomplete. Complete fertilizer has all 3 of the primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. An incomplete fertilizer does not. It may have only 2, okay, or it may have only 1 of those nutrients. On the right hand example here, this Vigoro Ultra Turf fertilizer, it's a 2904. All right, no phosphorus in it, so it's not a complete fertilizer from that standpoint. But it does contain a fair amount of nitrogen and a little bit of potash in there, a little bit of potassium. Anyone can be the right one depending on what the nutritional level of the soil is, and that's why you have a soil test to know whether you need a complete fertilizer, or you need an incomplete fertilizer, or maybe you need a nitrogen only fertilizer. Here's an example of a potash only fertilizer. Sometimes these can be useful for later applications on cool season grasses in late spring, to add some potassium there to maybe give them a little boost of strength and vigor to help better withstand some of the hot, dry stresses that are often associated with our summertime. This one also has got some crabgrass pre-emerge included with that. We're not talking about weed control here right now. We're talking about fertility. That's an example of a potash only fertilizer, a 007. I bet the only fertilizer that would be of no value at all is one that reads 000. So I'd encourage you to avoid buying one that's labeled like that. When you spread that fertilizer, it doesn't matter how you do it. It's like spreading seed. You just want to spread the correct amount uniformly over the unit of area that you're treating. So pictured here, we've on the left side, we've got a broadcast spreader, rotary spreader. On the right side, we've got a drop spreader. You know, from I guess from an accuracy standpoint, the drop spreader may be a tick more accurate because it's only going to put fertilizer where you put that spreader. So you don't worry about you know, throwing fertilizer off on the sidewalk or over into a flower bed with a drop spreader unless you run the spreader up into the flower bed or on the sidewalk. Of course, it's got a much more narrow working width. It takes longer to apply the product out there. So there's sometimes trade-offs, but either one can be the right one. You just utilize, the goal is to supply the correct amount of fertilizer uniformly over the area that you're fertilizing. There's a potential problem of using a drop spreader by missing strips because it does not spread fertilizer unless the spreader is pushed over that area. So it's very easy to miss places if you don't allow that drop spreader to overlap just a little bit as you're making your passes across the yard applying that fertilizer. I would point that out. A way to avoid that, okay, is make your fertilizer application with drop spreaders while the dew is on the grass. Why do that? Because you can see the tracks that you create with the spreader, and you'll be better able to overlap those passes a little bit if you can see the tracks. But the tracks are more difficult to see on dry grass. With a broadcast spreader, you know, to help ensure a good uniform application, it's not a bad idea to apply half of the required fertilizer going in one direction, and then come back and apply the other half of the fertilizer going in a right angle to that first direction, just to help ensure you get good uniform application pattern from that spread. You know, there's no research anywhere that shows that concrete or asphalt benefits from the application of fertilizer. So if you are spreading fertilizer in a lawn next to a hard surface like this, like a sidewalk or a driveway, you know, take the leaf blower, broom or something, push it back, blow it back into the yard area. Number one, it's too expensive to waste. So you want the grass to get the benefits of it. And number two, very often it's going to wind up in a storm drain somewhere and wind up in a creek or a stream of some sort and potentially cause some negative problems there. Irrigation is another one of those primary practices. And you know, that's the plants have got to have, you know, they got to have some sunlight, they've got to have soil to grow in, they've got to have nutrients, they got to have water. Okay, we can't have much influence over the amount of soil that's out there. We can't have much influence over the amount of sunlight they get, but we can influence fertilizer, we can't, or nutrition, and we can influence water through the form of irrigation. Now, turf grasses, you know, it tells us on the slide here that turf grasses can use 1/10 of an inch to 3/10 of an inch of water per day, depending on the weather conditions. Hot weather, windy conditions, the use rate typically goes up. Not typically, it does go up. So that means that on like a high water use day, when these grasses are using 3/10 of an inch of water, that equates that to what, like a little over 2 inches of water in the course of a week. How much water is that? An inch of water. Okay, and then that's on a per 1,000 square foot basis. So an inch of water is about 620 gallons of water on 1,000 square feet. That's how much water that is. So 2 inches of water, then you're talking about what, 1,240 gallons of water over 1,000 square feet in a week's time. Does that mean that the grass that you have got to apply that much water to the surface, either through rain, or you're not going to apply it through rain, but does it have to fall on the surface of the soil through rain or through irrigation? No. It means that the grass has to have access to that much water in the course of a week. And that brings me back to one of the very first things I said when we started this evening, soil depth. Okay. If you don't have enough soil depth, you can't grow grass. And if you don't have enough soil depth, you can't grow any crop. Excuse me. The reason soil depth is so important is the deeper the root zone, the more water, the deeper the soil is, the deeper the root zone is. And the deeper the soil is, the more water can be held in that root zone. And therefore, that ground that is deep, or that soil that is deep, will hold more water than a shallow soil, and it can go longer without needing supplemental rainfall or irrigation before the grass or whatever the crop is starts to show any kind of drought stress. That's why deep soil is so valuable for any crop, grass or whatever, legal grass, illegal grass, whatever the case may be. Deep soil can go longer without needing additional water applications because it holds more water available for those plant roots to utilize. Compacted soils, okay, where does water reside in the soil? It resides in spaces between the solid soil particles. So a soil is said to be compacted when the soil particles, the solid particles, the sand, the silt, and the clay that go together to make up the solid portion of that soil, the mineral part of the soil. When those solid particles get pressed together so that the pore spaces are smaller, that in the pore spaces where that water resides, that's where it's held in the soil. So a compacted soil has less pore space than a non-compacted soil. And so compacted soils hold less water than non-compacted soils. That's why if you can avoid, traffic on the yard, on the turf, when it's really wet, you can minimize compaction or reduce compaction. And that's one reason you want to minimize compaction, because it will hold less water, compacted soil will. And it also makes, less room for roots to wiggle down through those solid soil particles, because they got little tiny pore spaces versus larger pore spaces on non-compacted soils. Grass can tell you when it's starting to suffer. It doesn't have to turn brown before you get the idea that it's starting to suffer from drought stress. Footprinting is one of those indicators that the grass is beginning to suffer from drought stress. And footprinting means that, if you walk across the yard in the morning, you create footprints in the grass. You come back out at noontime or so, and that grass has not popped back up yet. You can still plainly see those visible footprints. That's an indication to you that that grass plant, the water, the fluid in the plant is not at the level it should be. It's lost turgor pressure, and so it is not rebounding as rapidly. So at that point, you might think about if irrigation is in your future, you might start applying it at that point. We don't all have irrigation, I understand that. But I'm just saying, if you do, then that's a trigger, an indicator to you that you might think about applying some irrigation. It's a good idea to allow the grass to become stressed a little bit before you irrigate. You're just helping to, toughen it up, a little tough love there. But that's an indicator that the grass is showing some drought stress, and you might begin the irrigation of it. When you do use an irrigation system, just like there's no research that shows that asphalt or concrete benefit from the application of fertilizers, there's also no research that shows that asphalt benefits from the application of irrigation water either. So you don't want to apply irrigation to the point that it runs off of the site faster than it soaks in, so that it does wind up down here in the storm drain. On a sloping area, you may have to change the rate, your length of irrigation cycles, so that it doesn't run for as long, to give that water a chance to soak in before it starts to run off. But that's something you've got to monitor and to maintain if you're going to use an irrigation system. Ideally, watering early in the day is the best time. Because you don't have as much water loss just from evaporation. In the heat of the summertime, early can be 3 o'clock in the morning, from 3 to 6, or from 5 until 8, something like that. Middle of the day, it's not the worst thing in the world. You're going to have some water loss from evaporation probably on hot days in the middle of the summer, but probably the worst time from a plant health standpoint is late in the day, so that grass is really, really wet when the sun sets down on it, because it's hot weather. We've got humidity because we live in Tennessee. You've got all that free moisture out there. We've created a great environment for these fungal pathogens to grow in. And those fungal pathogens are the cause of all the diseases that we see, or most all the diseases that we see that attack turf grasses during the growing season. So in a perfect world, we would not water those grasses late in the day, so that the grass leaves have a chance to dry out some before the sun sets on them. So just kind of some irrigation recommendations: moisten the entire root zone when you irrigate. Don't apply water to the point that it runs off, or that it ponds up out there and doesn't soak in. Avoid irrigating in sunset. Conserve water by irrigating in the morning. That could be from 3 to 6 in the morning, or from 10 to 1 o'clock. And then if you don't have a rain sensor, put one in, because people talk about you when you've got an irrigation system and it's out there running and it's pouring down rain at the same time. So having some kind of rain sensor installed to keep that from happening is probably, folks won't talk about it so much, and it's just the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do. Okay, that takes us through the primary practices. Dethatching, we're starting into the secondary practices. Dethatching is the removal of thatch. Well, why do we want to remove thatch? First of all, what is thatch? Thatch, as you see the definition there, an intermingled layer of dead and living leaves, stems, and roots located between the turf grass foliage and the soil surface. So I think this bottom picture down here does a better job of illustrating what thatch is. So you see the grass blades, the above ground, the vertical shoots. Then you see the crown of the grass. That's the point that the grass grows from. Okay. Then you get into what's called a thatch layer. So you can see the soil surface layer, and then this kind of no man's land is called a thatch layer. This sort of light brown, organic material right there. Okay. And then the slide goes on to tell us that turfs with more than a half inch of thatch should be dethatched. Well, why should thatch be removed if it gets too deep? Well, one of the reasons that thatch should be removed is that it repels water. So if you have a half inch or more of thatch on that soil, it's not going to be on the surface. It's going to be at that interface between the root zone and the soil surface itself. Then that soil is hydrophobic. It resists wetting. Okay, so that grass, it doesn't take, that soil does not take irrigation as well. And it also creates an environment for some insects like sod webworms, for example. They like to be down there where you got a good thatch layer to live in, etc. So it's not as healthy for the grass. Now, do all grasses develop thatch? Well, potentially, I guess they can, but those creeping grasses like Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, and centipede grass, maybe Kentucky bluegrass, the creeping grasses, they develop thatch much faster than bunch grasses do. Okay, so when that grass develops a half inch or more layer of thatch, it's good to think about removing that thatch. Start thinking about it. Dethatching can be done with a variety of different tools. One of those tools is a dethatching rake. You see them pictured right here. If you never used one, by all means, I suggest you do it. It's great exercise. It's fun. If you have children or grandchildren, encourage them to do that too, because they'll thoroughly enjoy it, and they'll appreciate you for allowing them to experience that. Their life will be more complete because you let them have that good fun of using these dethatching rakes. And the way they work is, they got the curved blades. You just work that rake back and forth across the turf area there, and it pulls some of that dead material up and allows that thatch to be pulled up on the surface. Then where you can rake it up and get it off of the turf area, put it in the compost pile, whatever the case may be. Now there are mechanical dethatchers. If you think that this machine looks an awful lot like that slit seeder we saw earlier, you'd be exactly right. A dethatcher or vertical mower, it can also be referred to as a vertical mower, is basically a slit seeder without a seed box attached to it. You see these blades, these vertical blades are attached to that horizontal shaft, and as these things spin, it's got a height or a depth adjustment on it up here that will allow you to set how deeply those blades cut down into that soil surface. And as they rotate through there, it'll pull that thatch material up, like you can see, here in this inset. There's a dethatcher going across Bermuda grass turf, pulling a lot of that dead material up. So that thatch, here we can see the turf that's been dethatched. You can see the grooves still visible where the dethatcher went through it. So when you run a dethatcher across the turf, it pulls the thatch material out. Then you rake up, vacuum up, whatever the case may be, the thatch, and put it in the compost pile and get it off the yard. Aerification is another secondary practice. Core aerification is by far the preferred way to aerify. And here's an example of a self-propelled powered core aerator. Core aerification, it's called core aerification because the machines pull cores of soil out of the ground. In the process of doing that, they create holes in the ground. So why do we aerate? Why is aerification a good deal? Okay, well, we've got a picture here that tells us exactly why. On the far left side, We see grass that has shallow, weak roots. This is before aerification. We know they're shallow and weak because it tells us so. Then the next slide in the center, lo and behold, the aerator has gone across that turf and it has punched holes in the ground. And so it has created these spaces, and these spaces, air and water and fertilizer nutrients, they can flow down into those aeration channels, into the soil where the grass roots can get them. And lo and behold, the grass responds by growing deeper roots into those aeration channels and just making a stronger grass. Well, we can draw pictures to look any way we want to look, but does it really work that way in real life? Well, yes, it does. So here you see an example of the roots growing into an aeration channel. Okay, you're creating pore spaces by core aerification. So that does create more openings, more pore space for air, more pore space for water to enter the soil. It makes it easier for nutrients applied through fertilization to enter the soil, and the plants respond in a positive manner. Here's another example. This is, this was a more of an athletic type field. It's a highly amended soil. You can see a lot of sand particles in here. But this, going the wrong direction. Here we see more of like a native type soil. Kind of more of a clay soil with the aeration holes punched. And look at these roots growing down in here. What's this dark material? That's compost, where it's been top dressed with compost after aerification. So core aerification does help. Okay, it can improve water infiltration, water movement into the soil. It can help relieve compaction. It can be a positive thing. Top dressing is one of the final things we'll talk about. Top dressing is a realistic way to add organic matter to an existing turf. And that's not something that we do an awful lot of here in our part of the world as compared maybe to some other places. Kind of more in the Northeast, I think we see more top dressing done. There are lawn services that do offer top dressing here in Tennessee. But most, I'm not acquainted with many homeowners that have done a lot of top dressing to their home lawns, but it is a realistic way to add some organic matter and improve an existing turf soil without totally destroying the entire yard. And it's great fun and exercise too. And it also is a good way to cover grass, new grass seed if you're doing overseeding in the fall of the year. But the way that it works is you core aerate the lawn area. Okay, you punch lots of holes in the yard with a core aerator, and then you top dress it with just a thin layer of organic material, like a good, a mature compost. And mature compost means it's not heating up anymore. It's gone through that heat cycle, so it is made. Okay, it's not going to be getting hot anymore. You can buy compost bulk from a lot of different garden centers. You can buy it by the bag. A very expensive way to buy it, I guess. But buying it by the trailer load, by the truckload, by the scoop from the sales yard, it makes it more economical. It's hard work to spread this stuff by hand, but you can core aerate a yard and then get the compost out there, take it out there a wheelbarrow at a time, create small piles, then rake it in. It takes a fair amount of material, though, to cover a large area. And you're not going to put a thick layer of compost or top dressing material out there on an existing turf. If you want to put a 1/4-inch layer out there, a yard will cover about 1,200 square feet, almost 1,300 feet. A 1/2-inch layer, if you want to put a 1/2-inch thick layer of top dress of compost, that yard covers 645 square feet. So, conversely, to cover 1,000 square feet, it takes 0.8 of a cubic yard. Okay, at a 1/4-inch, if you want to put a 1/2-inch layer of compost on 1,000 square feet, it takes a little over 1.5 yards of compost. So it takes a fair amount of material to do a large area. So that's one reason that folks are not too keen on doing that, because it's a lot of doggone work if they're having to do it by hand. Now, there are machines out there. Like I said, there are some lawn services that do provide this. They'll offer that. There are top dress spreaders, okay, compost spreaders, top dressing machines. Here's a motorized one in this picture on the left. So the lawn was core aerated, and now this gentleman is running the top dresser across the yard. It's a motorized self-propelled thing, and it's just spreading it out there. And then, if you did it by hand, you come along with the a drag mat, like behind this little riding lawnmower right here, to drag across the surface to help encourage that top dress compost material into those aeration channels. You can do that even if you spread it by hand versus raking it in. There are also some hand human powered push models of top dressers that are out there that folks can order or they can purchase those and use them in their home lawns. That is a way to add some organic material into an existing turf without destroying the yard in the process of doing that. So in the last few minutes, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about pest management. From a turf grass standpoint, pest is anything that takes away from the overall health and vigor and appearance and performance of the crop. In this case, we're talking about turf grass. Those pests can be diseases, they can be insects, but the one that we probably, as extension officer, more questions about, and one I want to address here just a little bit in our remaining time, are weed pests. Okay, there are a lot of different weeds out there. You got summer annuals, you got weed grasses, broadleaves, winter annuals, perennials. We got warm and cool season perennials. We got biennials. We've got those that are grass-like. They're not grass weeds. A lot of different weeds out there, and so sometimes it seems like it's just overwhelming. How are we going to fight these things? What are we going to do about it? Well, I want to point out one thing: the best weed control is a good dense turf grass population. So by following those good agronomic practices, following those recommended practices to help you grow and maintain a dense stand of grass, that's the first step in fighting a weed population. Okay, keep a good population of grass out there, because any piece of ground will only support so many plants at a time. If the ground is covered in desirable plants, it doesn't have room to support those undesirable plants like weeds. So that's the first step. Follow those good turf grass management practices that we've talked about to this point. Second thing is take advantage of some resources out there. This resource, this is University of Tennessee Turf Grass Weed Science page, Tennessee, tnturfgrassweeds.org. You can go to that and you can find some good resources there that can help you in your fight against managing weeds in your home lawn. One of those is the mobile weed manual. The mobile weed manual, and this is a device this is an app, you can download it on your smartphone. You can utilize it to help identify weeds. You can just go to mobileweedmanual.com. It can help you identify weeds. Another option out there is the University of Tennessee Weed Science Program does have a weed diagnostics center, and you can send samples, physical samples, to the Weed Diagnostics Center. If you go to the Tennessee turfgrassweeds.org page and click on the emblem here for the Weed Diagnostics Center, it'll tell you how to do that. A basic weed ID sample, it costs $29. And if you're a resident of Tennessee, to get that sample identified by sending it in to the Weed Diagnostics Center. Another option, or another a good feature out here, are these different fact sheets. You get fact sheets here for different weed species and information on how to control those. Here you see wild violet, hairy bittercress, et cetera. And you open up that one for ground diving, for example. Here's what it looks like. It gives you information about the weed in question, and then recommendations on how to control those weeds, et cetera. Another tool that's available for folks to help control weeds. This is a website that's maintained by one of the herbicide companies. This is by PBI Gordon, and they produce a lot of different weed control products for homeowners and professionals alike. It's called weedalert.com, and you can search by the region of the United States you live in. Got a lot of pictures on there. You can also email good images to your extension agent. Email Carla good pictures. And I say good pictures because the picture on the left here is a picture a gentleman sent me back in the winter. I don't know what this brown grass was out there. Well, I don't know. It's like brown grass because there's no detail. But he took a close-up image of it, and you can see that there's some dormer Bermuda grass, and that's a good image. And that's what a good image does. It shows lots of detail that can help whoever's looking at that identify what the weed in question is, or the plant in question is. So those are all options to identify some of those weeds. Or you can bring a physical sample into your county extension office, and the agent there can examine it in person instead of looking at it via picture. But those are options that are available to you out there. You know, weed control methods. I mentioned prevention through good competition by maintaining a good dense stand of turf grass. That's your best option. That's your first option. Then the second option is by using a prevention kind of a product, create a chemical barrier. That's the pre-emergent herbicides. You know, you hear things all crabgrass preventer in the spring of the year prevent crabgrass. That's a pre-emergent herbicide. And then the other chemical option is the use of a post-emergent herbicide. That's a product that's going to be applied after weeds are already up and growing. So those are all weed control options that are available. If you're thinking about pre-emergent herbicide options, what are they used for? Those are used on annual weeds. Okay, pre-emergent herbicides help prevent annual weeds from establishing. They don't keep from germinating. They keep them from establishing a root system after they germinate. So we can categorize annual weeds into two main types. Winter annuals, okay, those typically germinate late August, early September is when they start. So those things many of them have germinated now, and they're going to continue to germinate on through the fall. Those are things like chickweed and henbit and purple dead nettle, hairy bittercress. Those they have the purple and the white flowers that you see in yards every spring. Okay, some of those are out there growing right now. Well, a lot of that can be prevented in the fall, late summer, fall, by using one of these pre-emergent herbicides prior to their germination. Then the other category of annual weeds are the summer annuals. Those are the ones that grow, begin to germinate in the spring of the year, and they grow throughout the summer. That's things like crabgrass and goosegrass. Typically, the period to apply a pre-emergent herbicide to prevent those populations is going to be the late February to early March timeframe. That's when those pre-emergents are applied. There are a lot of pre-emergent products out there. They're all effective when used appropriately. And appropriately means that they're applied prior to seed germination, and they're applied at the correct rate. Remember, we talked about measuring yard area so you know how much grass seed to purchase. You need to know the same information to know how much herbicide to apply, whether you're applying a pre-emergent or post-emergent product. You've got to know the size of the treatment area to ensure that you put the correct amount out there. That's part of it. For summer annual weeds like crabgrass, soil temperature is what triggers the germination of those weed seeds. Well, most folks don't go out and measure soil temperature in the late winter, early springtime, but they can certainly notice pretty yellow flowers like you see here on this forsythia bush. That's a visual indicator. When you see forsythias blooming heavily, like you'll see in this picture here, that tells us that the conditions are right for things like crabgrass and so on to begin to germinate. And so it's time at that point to make an application of that pre-emergent herbicide product to control those summer annual broadleaf weeds, or summer annual grass weeds and broadleaf weeds too. In all the pre-emergent products, regardless of the compound that's used, they all have this requirement that they need some irrigation on them after they are applied, either through the form of rainfall or through irrigation water that you apply. The reason is that herbicide compound needs to be moved down into the soil surface where it creates a barrier that will inhibit those newly germinated grasses and broadleaf weeds from producing and establishing a root. Okay, and so therefore they'll die. They don't necessarily keep the grass, or they don't necessarily keep the weed from germinating. They keep it from establishing a root, and so it cannot live after it germinates. Post-emergent herbicide products are applied to weeds that are up and actively growing. If you looked around in your yard out there and you're seeing some henbits of chickweed growing already, now would be a good time to apply a post-emergent herbicide product to them, because they're young and they're actively growing now, and they really haven't started to produce seed. That's not going to happen in many cases until, after the first year, we start transitioning in the spring. So annual weeds apply when they're young and actively growing. Perennial weeds, like dandelion, for example, or wild violet, things like that. You want to apply while they're actively growing before they go dormant. Many times, late summer, fall is a good time to treat those perennial weeds, especially the warmer season perennial weeds, because they will take in more of the herbicide product as they start to transition into their winter phase, as they're trying to store carbohydrates so they'll have enough energy to survive through the winter. So this is not a bad time of the year for making applications to things like wild violet and so on, those tough to control perennial weeds. Some are more active in the spring of the year, some more in the fall of the year. Are there organic weed control options out there, herbicide options? Well, sure there are. You know, physical removal is always the first line, I guess, of organic weed control. When you pull one up, you chop it out with a hoe, whatever the case may be, that's organic. There are some non-selective organic products that will use oils, for example, like citrus oil or acetic acid or vinegar. Okay, that will certainly kill plants. It'll kill desirable plants as well as undesirable plants. Corn gluten meal was discovered back in the early 1980s by some folks up at Iowa State University. It's having potential to prevent the growth of some annual weeds. It's out there. It's a product that can be utilized. You know, if you're interested in doing that, you just need to research it a little bit and decide if that's a fit for you. It's typically it's going to be a little more on the pricey side compared to some things because it has to be used in a fairly heavy rate, a very heavy application rate to be effective. Chelated iron is a selective broadleaf herbicide. A few years ago, a product came on the market called Fiesta. Which was basically a chelated iron. And the premise of it was that some plants have a sensitivity to iron. And some of those plants that have a sensitivity to iron are weeds. There's some research out there that here's one, I think it was from Nebraska, that references the efficacy of using a chelated iron product. You know, one example I mentioned was Fiesta, and it lists a few more brand names out here, but Fiesta is the common one that you're going to find, I think, in the commercial market as a way to knock back some of these broadleaf weeds, in this case, dandelions. Okay, and in their experiment, they indicated that they saw some benefit and some efficacy of using this iron-based alternative herbicide to controlling some broadleaf weeds. Now, here's one from an experiment done by the folks at Purdue University a few years earlier. Well, they didn't get any weed control out of it. So the point is, there are some options out there. There's some results, or some experiments show good results from it. Some don't agree with that. But the point, I guess, is there are some things out there that an individual could certainly try if they were looking at maybe what would be considered as an alternative or an organic option for weed control in a home lawn setting. But again, the mobile weed manual can be a good tool to help you identify potential weed control products, because it does have a weed control feature in that mobile weed manual. That's the app. You can download it from the tnturfweeds.org. Okay, but it's got an ID tool that can help you identify weeds, and then once you identify it, you can go through and describe the condition you're working under. Like, I want to control this weed in a cool season turf grass, and it will come up and list different products that will do a good job of controlling that weed in your particular setting. So it can help you identify products to utilize out there. Most all of these products have not most all of them, every single product out there, herbicide product, any kind of a pesticide whatsoever, will have use directions on there for a reason. And here's a prime example. This picture was taken in Murfreesboro in a home lawn on the 24th day of July in 2018. I don't know how many folks can remember what July 2018 was like, but in Rutherford County, Tennessee, it was over 90 degrees every day that month, best I can recall. So this individual called and said, I sprayed some stuff on some crabgrass. It killed crabgrass, but it hurt the Bermuda grass too. So what's the deal? There must be something wrong with the grass out here. I must have a disease. So we investigate, and the gentleman does share. Here's what I used on the on the crabgrass. And it plainly says on the label, do not apply to Bermuda grass when daytime temperatures exceed 85 degrees. There's a reason those directions are out there. Okay, so if you're going to use any kind of pesticide product, herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, whatever, follow those directions. All right, folks, I promise you we're about to wind this thing up. You've been very patient. What about, though, when things just don't work out and your turf gets thinned out, and then you're thinking about renovating that? Okay, there's a couple of approaches you can take to renovate turf. One of those is strictly just an overseeding operation. When you have areas in a turf where the grass has been thinned out, but overall you still got 50% or more of the ground that's covered with desirable plants, that lawn area is a candidate for just overseeding to increase the turf grass population. And this is primarily done on bunch type grasses, things like tall fescue primarily. Okay, but it'll get thinned out sometimes in the summer, like Carl mentioned earlier, the drought from this year, the dry weather, the hot weather, and there'll be patches of it killed out, or sometimes small patches, sometimes large patches. But you still got some desirable grass out there. So you just want to improve the population of desirable grasses. So how can you do that? Just by overseeding. I mentioned back earlier that the slit seeder is a tool that is very often used for overseeding. It's a great overseeding tool for a case like this because it cuts slits in the ground, it cultivates the ground, it plants the grass seed, and it'll let you do that without tearing the entire lawn area up. Another option is to come in and core aerate because you're creating open soil in the ground, soil openings there for those grass seed then that you can come on and broadcast, and those seed that come into contact with those aeration holes have the best chance of germinating. Now, what about if the lawn has less than 50% desirable plants? If that's the case, then it's probably a better candidate for total renovation than it is for overseeding. And if you've got less than 50% desirable plants, a total renovation project, well, just pictures are better than words. So here's a gentleman back a few years ago. His lawn was comprised better than 80% of crabgrass in the front yard. He said, "I don't like this. I want to clean it up. How can I do it?" So he followed these recommendations. The recommendation was to kill the undesirable crop out there. In this case, it was crabgrass. So he treated the crabgrass area with glyphosate, that's the active ingredient in Roundup, a non-selective herbicide. So he sprayed it out with the glyphosate. Just got ahead of myself. Sprayed it with the glyphosate. It killed the glyphosate did a good job. It killed the crabgrass. Then down at the equipment rental store, he rented a dethatcher, not because he's trying to remove thatch, but he's going to remove some of this dead plant material out here and also cultivate the soil. So he rented this dethatcher. He runs it across. You can see where he's been. He started at the street. And he's working back towards the house. So you can see the dark area here. That's where the dethatcher has been run across the yard. It has cultivated that ground. It's kind of loosened the soil up some. Then he comes along with his rake and his wheelbarrow. He raked up a lot of that dead residue that he pulled up with his dethatcher. Okay. Now you can see his other supplies. He's got his fertilizer out here. He's using Kentucky 31 tall fescue. That's what he chose to use. All right, it's his yard. He can do what he wants to. That's fine and good. So he then spread the fertilizer. All right. Then he spread his grass seed, and then he set his little sweep type sprinkler out here, and he watered it 3 times a day, just a little bit in the morning, a little bit middle of the day, a little afternoon, in order to keep that ground good and moist so he can get germination. And 6 weeks later, there he is. He's got a nice pure stand of tall fescue grass, whereas before he was roughly at 80% crabgrass in that part. Well, folks, you've been very patient, I guess, and you have shown that you have good persistence and survivability to sit through this session here on lawn care. But as I close, I want you to remember there are worse things in life than working on the lawn. And one of those, I do believe, is being chased by a mean rooster. So That concludes everything I want to say to you this evening. If you have any questions, now would be the time to ask those. And if they're hard questions, ask Carla. If you're easy questions, you can ask me, and I'll do my best to try to answer those.
All right, so do we have any questions?
The best time to irrigate, you may have said that. Over.
The best time to aerate, and can you over aerate?
Can you over aerate? Okay, yeah, you can under the right conditions. And you're going to over aerate. Well, and it's not really true to say over aeration. If the ground is really wet, you can make a real mess out of things and tear up more than good than you do by running a core aerator through really wet ground. Okay, but otherwise you're not going to over aerate. Now, keep in mind that aeration, core aeration, does cause damage, physical damage to the grass. So it needs to be done when you have a period of good growing conditions after the act of aeration to allow it to recover. So for cool season grasses, it makes sense to do those in that late summer, early fall time frame, but for two reasons. Number one, you're going to have good growing conditions coming up because you're moving into the fall. And number two, if you need to overseed, well, heck, aerate, then overseed on top of the aeration, and then you've killed two birds with one stone. But if you don't need to overseed, you don't aerate in the fall, then spring of the year is a good time to do it. You just want to have a good month or so of at least that long of good growing conditions to allow everything to recover after you have aerated. On a warm season lawn, spring of the year, once Bermuda grass or zoysia grass has broken dormancy, is greened up good, then it's a prime candidate. I wouldn't suggest right now would not be a good time to aerate a Bermuda grass lawn because it's a lot of it's already gone dormant anyway, and it's not growing very good. So you're going to cause physical damage to it, and it's going to take a long time. Well, it's not going to heal up probably before it goes fully dormant. So warm season grasses, they should be aerated in the kind of latter spring time frame, early summer, late spring, early summer.
All righty, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Anything else? We got a question in here. Where do we rent one? Like the core aerators?
Yeah, core aerators. Okay, so now I don't know in the city of Clarksville, but in the city of Murfreesboro, the Home Depot rents outdoor power equipment. Fair Brothers, a lot of hardware. Any outdoor power equipment rental store.
Yeah.
That rents tools, power equipment tools, typically have those.
Yeah, I think Sunbelt rental.
Sunbelt, I bet you they
Yeah.
do. Yes, I imagine there are multiple places
Okay,
in a town the size of Clarksville.
Yeah,
that rent
co-op.
those tools.
Yeah.
Maybe. Now, our co-op here does not rent anything other than, they'll rent grain drills, but they don't rent any kind of lawn and garden equipment. And co-ops are independent. So some local co-op stores do things differently than others. So yours very well may be in their rental business. I don't know.
Okay. All right, one more.
Of the turf grass we talked about, is there one that's considered more durable for like foot traffic, like dogs or kids?
Okay, turf grass recommendation for durability for kids and dogs traffic. What would
Okay,
you
the
recommend?
the most durable is going to be Bermuda grass or zoysia grass. And of the two,
Bermuda
grass
or
is going to be probably the easier one to get established or the more readily established because you've got more options available out there locally. Whether it's from sod or from using a seeded variety. Now, assuming you've got a full sun location where you can use Bermuda grass, if it's a shady location, you don't have a choice. You're going to have to go back to one of those shade tolerant grasses, and unless it's really deep shade, then tall fescue is probably the more wear resistant of the grasses that will tolerate some shade. But now, if it's light shade, zoysia grass is an option for you. But zoysia grass is you're going to be probably looking mostly at sod. Okay, which is more expensive, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not spending your money for you. You got to decide that. But but sod is going to be the most expensive option out there. And there are a lot more zoysia varieties available via sod, especially the shade tolerant grasses. The shade tolerant zoysia grasses are going to be the sodded varieties. So if you've got light shade, zoysia grass is an option. But if it's full sun for wear and tear resistance, Bermuda grass, I mean, think about it. All the football fields in the southeast where they're going to be playing this weekend, just about every one of them, it's a natural grass surface, it's Bermuda grass. And it's that way for a reason.
What kind of grass is it?
Bermuda grass.
Oh, okay.
The Bermuda grass. Okay,
So-
I think that about sums it up then. Thank you very much, Mitchell. We appreciate your
Okay.
time tonight and,
Appreciate your patience.
all right, well, thank you. All right, we'll see you another day then.
All right, take care.
Have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Ooh.